So, hello everyone. Welcome to the second episode of Sheltering Places, Thinking the COVID Pandemic. We have a few guests here tonight, and Reza and Valentin will be hosting the session tonight with me. We also have few of the people who helped organize today's session with us from the News Center, including Eric and Federico, and more people will join. There's about 19 people are in the other room that are not panelists, but they would like to join us at some point. So we will add them. Unfortunately, tonight we have difficulty connecting the Zoom to YouTube. So we're still gonna try later to connect it, but if that doesn't work, we will make this video available to, like, afterwards, we will upload it immediately and it'll be available for sharing and viewing. It's just sad that we don't have it on right now, but I guess Zoom is going through like a mushrooming explosion of business, and they just don't know how to deal with all the technical difficulties that are coming up. But that's understandable. So let's pick up where we left off last week, which is where María was going to speak, right? But before María speak, then just to like make things a little bit exciting, Lucy was gonna join us from Beijing, but because it's too late, she already slept, but she sent us an awesome video, which we're gonna play.
I think that she was on Plague Pod, Robin's Plague Pod.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think so.
Anyways, let's play Yusi's video.
Thank you for inviting me to share my experience here. As you have known, I am in quarantine in Beijing, and I'm quarantined in a hotel room. So I live in the States, and I flew back after evaluating
Pause that. Yeah.
my healthcare situation and the fact that I really want to be with my family, and they're worried about me in this pandemic, so I decided to fly back. So I just want to share what is it like to be quarantined in Beijing in a hotel room. So when we arrive in the airport, there's a staff that there's people helping us to find which district, whether you're going outside Beijing or in Beijing, and I live here. So I go to the city residence resonated location, and then I went there, and you go to find your local community staff divided by districts or community area. We call it district here. And then I find them, and then they contact my apartment complex staffs, which is responsible for finding a hotel for quarantine, and then they put 10 people in the car, and they drive each person to the designated location, and here I am. So I will share both, ups and downs with my quarantine situation. And first of all, so just a regular, I'm here, and then there's a bed and shower, and it's functionable, and there's internet, thankfully, and I have the whole package is included with 3 meals a day, so breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they will put it outside my door, and I will need to wear a mask to go out and fetch my food and take it back, but I don't need to wear any mask inside because this is a non-circulating area that's just only lived and shared by me, myself. And every day I need to report my temperature twice a day. And then I report it through this app on my cell phone. Let's say, begin with the rough parts. So my rough parts, I would say that my hotel room is very minimal decorated. So I have no like a working table or chair, which is a little bit difficult for me in terms of being productive. But I do have this very enormous 2-meter wide bed, which is quite interesting. And I have been doing everything and living on bed. So I would say it's a little bit difficult for me to adjust, but I did purchase like a little table online, like a foldable one to put on my desk. Like online delivery is very developed and adjusted to this situation nationwide. And the second roughest part is there's no light in my bathroom, and it's not the same situation for everyone, but for this hotel in particular I'm staying is that the switch that shares the light shares with the ventilator in the bathroom, and so they have to cut it off to make sure that no risk of potential exposure to the air from other rooms. So it's both protecting me and protecting others from me. So the good part is that I feel I am really being taken care of. Every day or every other day, there is a whole team of medical staff that are taking care of people who are in quarantine, and they're assigned to each district and each community group. So every day or other day, people will call me and ask me how I feel health-wise, and that's very nice. And then also there's also other staffs that are taking care of me in terms of if I need something, if my parents or my family members wants to give me something. My mom today bring me some blueberries, and that was very lovely. And then the second thing I really want to share is something that really surprised me is the increasing care for my mental health, because I am a very anxious person in general, and being quarantined and with this whole global health situation, it's really escalating my anxiety level. But there is also a line for a line for mental consult I can call that are also designated, assigned to my district for people who are quarantined in a hotel. There are also lines for just in general for this pandemic, but I called the number that are taking care for my particular situation, and I called yesterday. I also called on Saturday, and they're very patient, and they offer me a lot of good advice on how can I be mentally healthy in this very particular situation. And to be honest, I'm really surprised, and because mental health in East Asia in general is usually not very up to date. I would say it's very ignorant, and so I think this is kind of like a positive byproduct of this pandemic. Is people are having more discussion, more conversation, more attention on mental health in general. So I'm really grateful. But by no means I'm not trying to say, oh, our situation is perfect here. There are, with the government, with something, there's always things to be criticized, but I do think that I'm very grateful that the situation and people are trying to contain the virus. And yes, so here is my experience. And I would like to share some of my thoughts on this pandemic, and also from what I've been thinking by being quarantined in here. Please stay home as much as possible. And if you have to sacrifice your normal routine life for, maybe a month, it's better to do it for a month in a rough way than you have to suffer it for month, maybe in the fall, until the fall, if you just do it mildly. And I have to say, I think this is not by country, it's the whole world is suffering this, and we should really stay together and be together. And it's very disappointing for me to see all the racism and whole political debate on this, because our enemy is the virus, is not other country. So I really hope that, and another thing I hope that I can bring in some conversation to this talk, or is the idea of freedom and liberty. I know that China, by political speaking, is not a democratic country, but it really gets me thinking what it means to be free and what it means to have liberty, because I personally do not feel I'm free in this quarantine room. I actually feel very liberated from the virus, which I wasn't feeling this when I was, before I left the States, because I feel I don't really know where my health is really going, and seeing other people not taking care of themselves is very anxious and very worrying me. So, and another thing I really want to add on is I don't need to be liberated from this quarantine hotel room, which some people has been saying this to me, is that I feel perfectly fine in this room. I do hope that my quarantine time can be over, but this is not a form. This will not be a form of liberation. And also, I agreed. Actually, I'm really happy I can be quarantined. Yes. So that's all. And Mo knows my contact information. If you want to talk to me, or if you have any question to ask me, feel free to shoot me a message. I would love to discuss this further. And thank you for giving me this platform to share. And I hope you are all in good health and have safety. Bye.
Yes, that was Yusi from Beijing. Very interesting point she brought up. We actually received the video last night, and I've been kind of thinking about some of the stuff she said at the very end. She kind of like gets you close, and then she kind of like makes you think about a few important things. Maybe we can discuss it later. I don't know. Maria, would you like to begin? Tell us a little bit about what's happening in Germany, in Berlin, and with our lovely publication, your publication. I was just a guest editor this issue, Arts of the Working Class, and all the activities you guys are doing around this crisis. Yeah, so it's yours now.
Okay, thank you.
We can't hear you.
Oh.
There it is.
My most recent book was Archives of the Insensible.
I'm so sorry. It's just like the
memory and
go ahead, Maria, it's yours. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just finished a day that it's 12 hours long, since we're having a crisis management with the street newspaper that we are dealing with. And
talk to people a little bit about it, because I don't know, everybody around the world knows what is Arts of the Working Class. And I mean, I know about it. I've been involved from the first issue, but.
Yeah, for those who don't know the street newspaper, this is a bi-monthly publication that we publish in many languages and distribute on the streets mainly. This is sold by street vendors in mainly cities like London and Berlin currently, and vendors keep 100% of the revenues. We sustain the magazine with the concept of curating ads to correlate with the contributions of authors and people that are invited or invite themselves to be part of every issue. So we try to convey two levels of conversation here. So the first is a self-critical approach to how publications deal with it or are produced today, and the question who is reading them and who can afford to read them. So that's why we chose 2 years ago to call it Arts of the Working Class. And this inherits two questions in itself, or raises two questions for everyone that is confronted to its also very complex cover. And that is the question that, is there a definition of the arts that is accessible to everyone? And if yes, which definition is that? So that's what we do. And I suggested Mo to not to go further into the issue that we are working together, that it's coming up in 2 weeks, but just to stay and talk a little bit about the current issue that is also in quarantine, since it can only circulate on the streets. The vendors have no chance to have the same circulation as always. And
basically, let me just reiterate what you said. The last printed issue is just sitting at the office because nobody can pick it up and nobody's on the street to get it and buy it. So you have a big stack of it, just like waiting.
Exactly. Well, we have dealt with this, let's say, situation in the past, since the first issue that we printed was on the frame of an exhibition that was Paul Sohatsky's solo show at the gallery Exile. Well, it was existing in Berlin. It's now moved to Vienna. And I suggested Paul to print 10,000 copies of the first issue that we managed to put together, and everybody was thinking like, are you crazy? This is where are we supposed to store this? And I just suggested, well, it's a beautiful amount to stack in just in the middle of the room, and that's what happened. So we didn't have any plan or any clue how to develop this, but it was a automatic domino effect in which everybody felt, everybody that experienced or witnessed this first, the launch of this first issue, offered us a certain kind of engagement that was already questioning the ways how people were working at the same time. For example, Mohammed Al-Hassani, who takes distribution house called Vice Versa Art Books, was the first person to say, but this shouldn't be only on the street, distributed on the streets, but you have to also think about other ways of distribution. And this is how we've been running, and now the 10th issue is out and waiting there. So maybe I can share my screen with you, but I don't know to which extent I have space here at Zoom to go further into the issue. Mo, can you tell me how is it everything?
Well, yeah, no, you know what I mean? I want you to relate it to the crisis, right? Like, and also you happen to know a lot about the German art system. You've been involved in like the curating.
Yeah, I mean, we can jump to that a political issue that it's also we have to deal with, and skip the issue, and I just send you a PDF, and then you can enjoy it.
Yeah, we can show some of the pages on the moderator screen if like can take over. But you know, just for those who don't know, it was that they announced this like package of help to freelancers and artists like 3 weeks ago. Nobody knew how it's gonna like play out, and then last weekend on Friday or something, they kind of announced it, and a bunch of people went in, crashed the system, and then they put a queuing system ahead of the server that would queue you, so that not everybody can just go in and get their like what they call a Corona grant, So the queuing system was kind of interesting because it slowed down the traffic of the internet, right? So it just made you wait, and it would only allow enough people that the computer processor could actually handle. And then they stopped that because they said we ran out of money. And then sometime Sunday night or Monday morning, they began it again. And then they basically stopped it again at 3 p.m. today or 1 p.m. today, saying that, okay, now we don't really have money. I think the federal government's gonna like turn it into a federal program, and whoever hasn't applied will just receive it from the federal government or something like that. So this is as far as I know. If you have more, Maria, maybe you wanna like, and also talk about the challenges of.
Yeah, sure. I'm not one of the artists or the representative of an association like the BBK, which is the artists union in here in Berlin, who could definitely tell you more about this. I'm speaking from a nonprofit organization that has also been hit by this. So referring to the way how we finance our organization, I mean, we don't do any charity, even though we work with people on different levels. And being having this distribution model, the first thing when the lockdown in Germany happened was like, okay, so I was 100% sure every single ad will fall down. So how to sustain a project like this, and to be honest, what the government and the different senates in the different cities of Germany have achieved is amazing, and Berlin is actually
super amazing,
exemplary for this, and it's not a grant, right? So this is for the bunch of freelancers that make the self-predatory precarious system of Berlin run, and this is money that the government is giving to every single small organization or freelancer, but this money has to be justified, right? So I haven't applied myself yet. We applied for the organization. We are as a nonprofit organization. We got within 24 hours. We got 14,000 euros without any. We just had to give our ID number for the finance ministry, and that's it.
Yeah, I can't believe how little.
That's it. But the tricky part is that we call our accountant and say, so how do we're supposed to say? I mean, of course, we lost double amount of money just within 1 month. But how do we say that the government is asking for people not to say how much money they lost for, I don't know, maybe the 10 different events, lectures, and launch meetings that to which Arts of the Working Class was invited, but to say which are exactly our costs as an organization. So I don't know how the government is going to do this, to be honest.
Well, the way it looks like it, they said,
and it feels like a gift, but this is probably exactly the bureaucratic change that was being necessary, not only for the last 2 weeks, but like for years.
Well,
so
the way they said it's going to work out is like, we're going to give you the money, and then we're going to come back at the end of the year when you do taxes, and you tell us how did it do, and you might have to give it back. That's the premise, right? Yeah. So, so depending on how well you did and how you work this into your life, you might have to give it back, but you also might not have to give it back. So it becomes kind of a tax issue a year later when you're doing your 2020 taxes, right?
Yeah, I think it's the first time where our art workers see themselves on the same level as a person who runs a restaurant, or someone that is a personal trainer for, I don't know, people that don't like to go to a fitness studio. So watching our labor be categorized as any other job is the perfect situation to rethink how to organize ourselves and how to value cultural capital at large. So this is something that we are dealing with right now. We're thinking, okay, this is going super fast. And it feels quite unreal, but it's totally doable, right? So I think
very nice. I can't complain.
Yeah, but this is only Germany, right?
But
so
you know, I also have like this paranoid thought, right? Like that maybe they know the kind of storm that's coming, because why would they just basically turn the printing machine on and print all this money and give it to freelancers? What kind of future scenarios people at the political power are thinking about that make them say, oh my God, we gotta like do the MMT and print a lot of money and give it to people right now because they might like, so it also worries me, you know?
Yeah, but it's not fictional money. It's not fictional money. That's all taxes. It's all taxes that have been just storage, and the job center gives, the Arbeitsamt just gives a report on how much money do they give actually to people, unemployed people every year. But it's the first time that art workers are treated as any other kind. So I think it's not only from the side of the government or the side of the policies that have to be implemented or that have to change, but also an attitude, you know. There are people here asking for landlords to stop asking for the rent until the quarantine is over, but at the same time they are receiving this money exactly to pay that kind of expenses. So how do we deal with this leftist discourse within the arts and within the realm of practice, and how this cliches of inequality can unveil the real inequality that has been happening systematically and structurally. So this is, yeah, basically what we've been dealing parallel to the rest.
Thank you so much. Let's bring in Jennifer and Barbara.
Sure.
How are you guys doing in Paris, right?
Hi. Hi,
Hello.
Barbara. Salut.
Barbara, thank you so much for accepting to join us to give us a little bit of report on what you've been up to. But I think the best person to interrogate you would be Jennifer.
Yes.
So there will be a back and forth between you guys, and we will just become audience for a sec.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here and meet you.
Mo, should I give a little introduction to myself here? A little
Absolutely.
contextualization. So,
well, let me give you an intro to you. Jennifer
okay.
was my artist for Bernie Sanders buddy, along with Lauren. Three of us worked really hard on organizing thousands of artists online to endorse Bernie Sanders. So that was our, basically all January, February was spent on that. And then we all know what happened. So, I mean, I've known Jennifer for a long time, but we really worked closely to get those thousands of signatures. And actually, Arts of the Working Class printed the entire letter in the last print issue and basically signed it. So did Reza, so did Valentin, and a lot of other people around us were part of the signatories to that letter, which was drafted by me, Jennifer, and Lauren Boyle of the Dis Collective. But yeah, so that was my little intro of you, Jennifer. Or maybe we could get back into that, to the Artist for Bernie a little bit later after you're done with Paris. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the campaign and all of the artists behind the campaign are important to take into consideration here, and also to relate to Maria's commentary about cultural workers. I wanted to bring Barbara in because she's been on the front lines of everything. Can you hear me okay, everyone?
Yeah.
Totally.
Mo is frozen. She's been on the front line with all of a series and network of artists and art workers that have been campaigning and demonstrating on the streets of Paris since December with regards to all of the retirement reforms. So I think that that's also really interesting how those retirement reform protests are now trickling into the COVID times, and what this is, what kind of situation we are in here now in Paris. Beyond that, on like a global level, I think we're still in quarantine, as you know, probably know. There's been an extension put forth. I think that's now until April 20th. Is that right, Barbara? I think April 20th.
That's
April 20th. But you know, as we know, it's probably going to continue. There's been a lot of different surveillance kind of measures also taken and integrated. I saw like a test drone on the streets with operated by the police. We have the civil army or the checking paperwork on the streets, and also the police checking this form, because you're required here.
Are they checking that form actually? Have you been checked when you're out?
Yeah,
You've been checked.
Yeah, I've been checked. Yeah.
So
they saw my ID from Texas. They said Texas is really far away from here. Like, you know, this is where you feel the territories and distance.
So
yes.
you have to write where you're going, print it every time, and carry it with your ID, right?
Exactly. You have to write where you're going. Now there's a time limit. So you have to kind of annotate the time that you left whatever building or your home.
What if you don't have a printer at home?
You can write it down if you want with your handwrite.
Oh yeah, so the number, and they can put it in a computer, and then they check that you did the form at home, right?
No, they just check. They're not scanning this form or anything, but they're just checking it visually. And then if not, you're fined. It was originally a fine of 135 euros. Now it's 200 euros. And it's escalating. I think that will continue over time. So what else did I want to say about that? Oh, that's more of the environmental situation, right? I don't know, Barbara, you're in Bagnolet. How is it Bagnolet is the suburb, the east suburb, just next to where I am, and which is Père-Lachaise, which is the east. So you can tell us a little there. I know that, just to give you a bit of perspective of what's happening with the infections, the infections were all, right now, the largest amount of infections are now in Ile-de-France, which is the area surround Paris, plus it's the area surrounding Paris. Before, they were attributed to different clusters throughout the country, but now there's a lot more of multiplication of cases here. But a lot of them were in the suburbs. So maybe, Barbara, you can talk about, I don't know how it is in Bagnolet, but in Montreuil was one of the first suburbs that was largely impacted. And right, another thing is that, which is something very significant, is that the army is now transporting bodies and to different locations across France. And I think this is a quite ironic act, because initially when the quarantine was announced, people started fleeing Paris, and then they were later criticized in different geographical locations because the Parisians were bringing the virus with them. But now they are sending in different patients to all of these different locations across France. No, I mean, I don't find a critique there, but it's just an interesting trajectory of geographies. But Barbara, you can maybe talk about Bagnolet, and then we can move into, I want to ask you a few questions more related to artist unions and those mobilizing efforts related to the retirement reforms, because I think all of this is actually really, it feeds one of another, we can say.
Yeah. Well, my understanding is like, I think we live like about 40 minutes walk from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a big difference between what's happening in Paris and what is happening, like, for instance, in my neighborhood. I think it's like they gave order to the local police station, and every police station manages in their own way, which is kind of dangerous. But for my case, since I live in a very mixed neighborhood, there's a lot of like people with no papers and immigrant workers. So there was generally a population that was subjected to control and have an illegal situation. So the police basically is very how you say, is very tolerant. And I never met them, and I'm out every day. So that's the situation in my neighborhood. And so we've been doing a lot of local action in my neighborhood. Like I'm participating in a group where we cook food for people. Every day it's rotating, and we bring them to people in need. So there's a lot of local action, and that's kind of nice also in my neighborhood.
Yeah, one last thing. I did see a small like teenager fight outside of the window yesterday, and then all of the like over 20 cops, like a huge police force came, but they weren't violent. I saw quite a bit of leniency, but you know it does vary probably from neighborhood to neighborhood. I'm in a particularly in an area where there's a lot of density in some parts with social projects, but and I imagine that it can get really tense, and that's understandable. So, but there was one guy tried to like, I think he maybe was on drugs or something, and tried to into this pharmacy, but there was a little bit of there's an air of tension, we can say, but nonetheless, also I see that it is doing fairly well just from my window, but I haven't heard of any types of riots or anything of that accord. Have you?
No, but I've heard of abusive cops.
Okay.
I have friends who've been controlled, and they were abusive. Like, and it's also part of a problem. So it's a friend. She's an artist. She's precarious. And when she got controlled, she was, so you have to stay within a perimeter of 1 kilometer when you go outside, not for your groceries, but for your walk, or for to do sports and jog. And she was like 1.5 kilometer. So they gave her a ticket. And she completely freaked out because she's at RSA, so she has hardly any income. She was supposed to get some jobs that got canceled because all the jobs she was supposed to install some show, and everything was canceled. So basically, she was completely freaking out, and the police guy was horrible and gave her a fine. And I heard another story of somebody who actually got a sort of panic attack, took her bike and outside of her house and got controlled. And the policeman was so close to her that she got a panic attack, and she got another fine for insult to a cop. So yeah, so that's the story I heard, which,
I mean, I think it's completely plausible. As we know, the police state here is something of concern, and maybe we can move into our conversation.
Actually,
and
Reza has some questions, I think. So why don't Reza ask some questions?
Go for it.
Thank you so much, both Barbara and Jennifer. Really, really fantastic insights on what's going on. So there are a few things that I genuinely am interested in, and this is by no means a snark. It might sound as a snark question, but I assure you that it's not a snark question. Mm-hmm. So the thing is that you brought up help and action at a local level. In the sense that, you know, well, yes, we can cook for each other, we can take care of each other, but isn't it just as ineffective of regular run-of-the-mill activism? In the sense that as long as the government, the state, and the entire population is not being mobilized, such basically, I would say, resolutions are rather like installing a sculpture at the middle of Wall Street and say that, you know, it can inform people. No, it doesn't.
Well, they did that, remember?
Yes, of course, that's a joke. Yes.
When they put the girl in front of the bull, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the first question. The second question, I think it's the role of the police. Sure, there is a police brutality. And, but the thing is that we should think about very carefully. You see, Mo can testify to this as a person who has been in a war situation. The second most atrocious war since World War I, Iran-Iraq war for 8 years. The sheer number of mobilized people who died and civilians who died was completely unparalleled in modern history, a war that no one paid attention to. So there are three choices: police, which is always incompetent, but it's better than nothing; military deployment to help people to distribute food; engineering corps make makeshift hospitals; and if necessary, create checkpoints. Then the worst scenario would be disintegration, precisely because of the mistrust in the system as a whole, police and military, would be the emergence of vigilantes.
So
vigilantes
like,
are far worse.
That's like the, what did Davor call it? The Mad Max scenario.
I would actually have a better, you remember back then, I mean, that was a dubbed version. Yul Brynner, the Ultimate Warrior. 2012, New York City. A man with a knife. That's it.
It's more like that.
So can you state your question again? I'm trying to understand.
No,
sure. The first one was the question about the effectivity of local help and action. And the second question was how far can we overstretch in our mistrust, which we are all mistrusting that. But how can we overstretch the mistrust in law enforcing units, from police to military, so on and so forth?
So, Barbara, you can speak for yourself, but I think I guess there is a question here about if there is any validity towards neighborhood brigades and brigading, because if that is a question, I do think that is more and more necessary in the United States. Look at what people have to start doing for themselves, because
yes, but how far is it effective? How far is it effective?
Well, if they're undermined by the healthcare system itself, right?
There is no healthcare system in the US. That's the whole problem, you see.
So people have to lean upon each other for certain things that have to be taken care of. I don't know the case of Barbara, what you were, maybe you can, Barbara, you can step in here and explain your position.
Well, for instance, like the distribution of food is completely illegal. So I assume that position that yes, we go, we are not within the law, and I'm fine with it, because when I put 2 and 2 together, for me, it makes sense. You know, when the confinement started, my biggest worry was how is the police going to behave with that fragile population? And I was inside my house. I was only anxious about that. So the first thing I did was to go check and find a place where I could install like a sort of a drop where there was the attestation, like the paper you had to fill, like to have copies available for them, because I didn't want them to get
Yes, the same thing about here.
Yeah,
I do the same thing.
yeah. So you see, for me, that there was this moment where, you know, the priorities were made straightened out very quickly. It's probably also because in the last 3 months of protest, I've been experiencing a lot of unfairness from the police. And so, of course, as you say, like this growing mistrust of the police is part of that process, in my process.
Yes, yes. And the thing, to be honest with you, here, there is something happens when we look into the history in terms of, you know, nations who have been struck by fundamental crises. Neighbors can actually create, as you mentioned, certain kinds of squads or brigades to help each other, which is, I think, is very good. But the thing is that the resources of neighborhoods deplete pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And also the resources of police deplete pretty quickly. And that's the moment that
and they're
you need to
patient.
be a little bit fearful of the situation. That's when you remember those documentaries in war-ridden situations where, for example, UN trucks with bunch of gun-wielding army peace corps are coming and basically throw grains on top of people's heads.
Yeah.
Reza, I wanted to say something in response to you, and I'm gonna like be the devil's advocate here, which is like, my metaphor is like, if I have a toothache on Friday night going into midnight and the dentist is not there till Monday, I'm gonna shove aspirin and Tylenol down my throat and maybe literally on the tooth, knowing this is not gonna like help in the long term, but until Monday, it's good. So I think
This is what I have been saying, to be honest with you. I told you, Mo, that I just do not want to die sober at this point.
Yeah, but no, but what I was saying is that yes, the neighborhood squad is limited and it can't replace government or like proper security and funding. But in the absence of everything, for now, all we can do is just deplete our own resources as much as we can.
Yes, but that might also, as I mentioned, that might also, if there is not a certain kind of self-determination and self-organization, that might devolve at the end of the day into vigilante groups, neighborhoods watching for themselves, xenophobia at the micro-local level.
Can I make a comment?
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely, go ahead.
Yeah, let's let Barbara actually speak a little, because she has to go very soon to a birthday party online.
Yes. Yeah, I can stay, I think, 15 more minutes. No, I just, when you're talking about resources, like a few days ago, the Ministry of Finances create a fund, like a call for donation to save the firms in France. And speaking about resources, when I saw that, I thought it was very, it was like the biggest irony, because So basically, there's no money given to, well, very, very little money given to art workers, and everything is focused around saving the firms. But there's also this call, so solidarity, or like, how you say, like this humility and things like this sort of humanistic, ideas, you have to go put it to
Kitsch humanism, yes, absolutely, yes.
So I prefer to keep my energy on my neighborhood,
No, that is good. That is truly is good. But I think that we should all do that. But I think that we should also be careful of not letting this turn into America 101 Ultimate Warrior, where basically you get gun-wielding neighbor watch.
Reza, let's bring Raphael because he's saying interesting.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. My apologies.
No, don't worry. Let's hear from Rio.
Hello, everyone. I was just mentioning the fact that the government that we have here in Brazil is very markedly on, you were talking about militarization and stuff, is a very marked government, not only at the national level, but also most of the governors that were elected on the local level, like on the state level, they are very into very militaristic discourses of like a different strategy of facing organized crime and so on. And this is being packaged together with coronavirus right now and getting a lot of acceptance in the sense that a lot of army initiatives are being launched at different places, not only to like deter people from going out of their houses and stuff, or like on agglomerating on touristical places specifically and so on, but they are being used like to foster very big national-wide sort of health programs by the military. And all of those is precisely a way to foster a lot of the abuses by the military that are very, very much everyday practice here in Brazil. Like, and what I'm most concerned here is precisely how not only the span of time, because here we took a lot of time to actually implement the measures of aid for people, and like measures of for deterring unemployment and mass dismissals of people from the working force and so on. But what happened here is precisely that after those measures are implemented, we are having a lot of a very different practice like throughout. So for example, here in Rio, we have the peripheries, and there are people that are systematically being denied care in hospitals in those zones specifically. So they are being denied tests, they are being denied sort of aid, and they're being sent back home. And by being sent back home, they are in places in which like there are no consistent measures of healthcare. And like just so you guys have like a picture in your mind, there are streets as narrow that a car cannot pass or that a car cannot access and so on.
Raphael, what is it based off of if one receives health? Because in the US, there was a man who died recently because he didn't have healthcare. He was denied the testing and the medical care. What is it specifically that people are denied access to? Because you guys have universal single payer. So
they are being denied precisely by the lack of allocating resources for those places, not directly denial in the sense of like that kind of refusal, but then they are being on those specific hospitals in a very local level, they're being, the common practice is sending them back home rather than trying to transfer them, for example. And,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, someone mentioned Bolsonaro and the COVID diagnosis. I think it was Ekin. And but yeah, the thing is that we don't have the disclosure if he has the diagnosis or not. If he does, he's like he's going for a hard time because he had like huge appearances in the media, like hugging, shaking hands with a lot of people during the time that he was like contaminated. And there's also the fact that he was delaying the approval of a lot of the measures. So for example, like we had, right now we are forecasting, I have even the data here. Let me see, I think it's, it comes to, like it's a $600 aid for workers, 600 reais aid for workers and so on. And this was being delayed a lot. and it rushed through Congress and Senate like it was sort of a consensual thing, but then he was delaying, withholding this benefit precisely for trying to like, it's sort of playing a power game with the media. So the situation here is very like, right now things are being fast forwarded because of there is a huge popular pressure. Like every day, I think Klaus mentioned the clapping for the professionals. Here we are not having clapping only, but also we're having like protests for the president from the windows in a lot of the windows, and you hear like the metallic noises echoing throughout the whole thing. So it's becoming sort of a kind of a protest through the window. So like I have a neighbor, for example, that screams at me every day because she says that I'm a communist and so on because I protest against the government. So we are having those kind of mobilizations in a very local side. In terms of solidarity, just like to finish, I don't think we have, I haven't seen this kind of solidarity that you guys are talking about here. I think that here it becomes a much more privatized thing. So like in the big blocks of buildings, we have some of the workers that work on the building administration and stuff are offering themselves to take like, I live in a neighborhood that I think that most of the people are elderly. So there is a lot of aid in this sense. And there are some like safety measures in terms of like having alcohol at places or have like disposable things to actually press buttons on elevators and so on. So this is happening, this kind of self-organizing, but it is very much a more of an institutional thing that is happening like inside the building rather than this network of solidarity, of interaction. Like I think it's much more top down in this sense.
Barbara, do you want to have your last words? We don't want to hold you up from attending your online birthday party.
No, it's fine. No,
because I think there was some information about the helpful artist that was circulated in the beginning, and
yeah, I wanted her to speak. What I think it's really, really important here is to understand, for example, how Artists for Bernie there was an objective or some kind of interest in maybe looking at a universal situation or universal sort of artists union, right? But the way this relates to COVID is interesting. But I wanted Barbara just to give a very brief introduction of what happened after the demonstrations here, or during the demonstrations, and what that means in the current panorama, and especially with regards to what the French government has offered the cultural ministry towards art workers here, because it's nothing like the German scenario that you have. It's a bit concerning. Maybe you can, in a nutshell, Barbara, like give your spin on it.
Yes. So, on the mobilization or about the COVID. Well, maybe I start with the proposition from the government.
Maybe you can start with the proposition from the government, but also kind of frame it within all of these small grassroots artist unions that have been developing versus the already existing union, which it doesn't have as much relevance, to other unions that we know of in the United States. So that could be interesting, I think, for the variety of participants here tonight.
Yeah, but it's I hope I don't get, no, it's fine. I don't think I'm going to get too technical. We're art workers, so it will be just normal. I've been involved in a collective since 2 years called L'Abuse, and through this collective we've been working around bringing out to the public, finding means to inform and bring out the situation of precarity and situation of abuse in the context of art, and with also kind of uniting all art workers on that idea. So bringing together artists and installers, curators, and so on, but also what was nice also when we started the protest for the pension reform strike, we managed to gather together a lot of collectives from different fields of culture and also different activities. So we had people from living arts, we had people from decolonizing collective, we had also queer collective, we had installers collective, and so on, but also like from, eventually we also had people from the Yellow Vest, from cultural field, intermittent, and then all these collective gathered, and we became like a group within the protests during the 3 months under the banner Art en Grève, which means art in strike. So it was kind of a big thing because it was not only like we gather as a group as visual art workers, but we also gathered together, we gathered as cultural workers. And there's so many different statuses. You have intermittent, you have independent workers, you have authors, artists. It's very complicated, and it's a bit like dividing to conquer the division to avoid people to get together. So it was like, I think, something quite new that hadn't happened for decades. And so we were protesting, and we were doing this opposition for this law. And then the COVID happened, and everything became difficult. Like now we cannot gather anymore. We used to gather every week. So everything is kind of challenging. So we also did the protests every day at 8, a bit like Raphael described. There's been like a movement to encourage to, instead of applauding, to shout out against the government and against the lack of money in the hospital, because it's really critical what is happening, how the government is dealing with the situation. It's really like they have no mask in the hospitals, etc. And also the government decided that he will create a solidarity fund, but it's addressed to companies. So you can apply as an independent worker, but you have to prove it's something like kind of very bureaucratic and kind of hazardous, because you have to prove basically that you've made less, that your income has lowered from 70% from last March. So if you're an independent worker, you never get, your incomes are never even. So it will work only for a few people. And then they give 22 million to the Ministry of Culture, was then divided between the different sectors. So between visual arts, theater, etc. So it's really nothing. And for visual,
that's 22 million euro, right?
22 million.
Just and compare that. Berlin alone just gave already finished 500 million euro to artists and freelancers.
Yeah. And so it's getting worse. It's 500,000 for artists and curators, etc., and 600 euros for galleries. So it's always the same message. Like they even gave more money to the private sector than to to the galleries than to the artists.
600,000, yeah. 600,000.
That 600,000 is for all galleries, is not just for like one gallery, right?
It's for all galleries, and also that 500,000 is for, registered artists, or up to like 70,000 artists, right? But imagine all the artists who are not registered because of the complications of the social system here, and because of the level of bureaucracy. I'm not even inscribed into that system because of it's so complicated. But
this fund is only if you have something canceled during the confinement. So it's very limited. It doesn't take into account just how it will impact globally your economy. It's just about dates and events. So.
Well, again, like just to bring back one more point that was like brought up online during the last 2 weeks, is that you don't see a unified European response. You see all this like Westphalian nation states coming back to life and kind of like assuming authority, and in each old nation state, in a union like Europe, you see governments acting differently. In Portugal, as Kasra was mentioning, they're deciding to treat all foreigners as locals.
Yeah.
in Berlin, people who've been working here as freelancers, even on a 1-year visa, qualify to receive money. So it's like, but that's Berlin. I was hearing from Munich that a friend of mine who was a curator who was not even allowed to get unemployment, even though he was laid off. You know, so it's all like this, like old locality is kind of like not allowing for a really good overall universal response to it. So, Anna, should we move to you? We need some deeper reflections and philosophy from someone who can help us. You know, last week we had a lot of that. This week we decided to stay close to the surface of the planet, the silent surface of the planet, as Anne-Françoise Schmidt would say, right? So, but maybe you can kind of like transcendentalize us a little bit and take us somewhere. I don't know. Maybe it's too much of a expectation, but I really was hoping to have you last week. But I'm glad you're here this week, and you can kind of like tell us what you were going to talk about. You can unmute yourself. There we go.
Hello, thank you for having me. So I don't know if I have some deep philosophical insight, but for me, what seems contradictory is that on the one hand, we are criticizing the governments because they are trying to save economy. And on the other hand, we are just counting how much money do we want from the government. So we're trying to do the same kind of reasoning. So we are criticizing the government because they are counting how much money they are losing because of the pandemic. And then we are making the same thing with ourselves. How much cake do we want? I don't think that is the right thing. I mean, not in sense of good or bad, but I think we are replicating the same kind of reasoning in the sense of how much money it will cost this situation, and so why criticizing the government?
But how do you reconcile these two different sort of like levels of sort of like expectation versus survival? You know, like how do you reconcile this? Because I don't think worrying about how people will survive in the next few months is like just like a exercise in hypocrisy.
No, it's not a problem of worrying about survival. I think it's a perspective. I think this is the occasion for observing how our society is working. So how our mind has been formatted in some way, and the way in which our mind can be formatted. So the spontaneous behavior and spontaneous thought are that kind of thought. In the sense that spontaneous reaction from the government is, okay, we have a conflict between protecting people or preventing disease, preventing death, and preventing the collapse of the economy. So this is the kind of conflict that governments are facing now. And the two things were not in conflict before, because protecting the economy and protecting people was the same thing.
No, but I think maybe the misunderstanding here is that we don't disagree that the virus crisis is already or will soon cause a huge economic problem. But
exactly.
We're all in agreements, even with like fascists on this and right-wing people on this and centrists and everyone, right? The question is always, how can taxes and government resources, especially government's ability to issue money, can be mobilized, and who should receive the help, and how this could prevent the second disaster or slow it down or you know, want to flatten the curve of that other curve, which is the curve of economy, you know? And of course, people who have been elected with the help of big business want the rescue package to mostly go to corporations and all that. and when I say we, I speak of a collectivity that maybe is hard to like show it here, but like we asks for more disbursement of funds at the lower level of society to kind of like regenerate the economy from the bottom up. If you put money in the pockets of people, they will have to go spend it on what they need, and that will cause another kind of like economic growth again, right? So it's these two different clashes. I don't think wanting our collective taxes or resources or sovereignty be used for this is a crime, or it's any kind of like replicating some kind of like problematic epistemology, right?
No, I don't think it's a crime. I just think that we are not reasoning differently from the governments we are criticizing. And so I don't think that we are sizing the occasion to think something different or to repurpose the system or to criticize it.
Okay, so
the only critique that we make against the governments, it's about the way in which they are dividing the money.
Okay,
but it's no more substantial than that. And I think that this crisis could be the occasion to see, to analyze the structure in order to try to think differently. And I think that we are in a sort of circle in which we are worried about the same worries, and we are not having another perspective. We are not making the effort of, okay, let's try to have another perspective.
Let's talk about this like speculatively about the kind of epistemic shifts that you think this kind of crisis is causing, and the kind of epistemic shifts you would like to see it causing.
I don't think it's causing any shift. I would like to, but I don't think it's happening. So I just think that it's showing it's a situation in which some structural points are really evident. So it's a privilege for the analysis, because we are really seeing conflicts that usually are not so evident. So I think that from a philosophical standpoint, what is interesting is the possibility of observing the way in which our society is structured and it's working, and seeing that everything is, all the political action is thought, is programmed or planned because of future risks, which are calculated in some way. So we are all behaving in a way which is supposed to prevent some risk, which is a future risk. And so this is really evident, because we are all behaving, all the measures are taken because of a risk, which is supposed to happen in the future. So we are quarantining people because we think that the line of the pandemic will be exponential according to some model. And the models are based on older pandemics, older situations like this, which are not the same, basically. And all the economic measures are taken with respect to models about the possible crashes in the future, but are not here yet. So it's really evident that all the behaviors of the measures are taken according to this idea of preventing a future unknown risk according to statistical models. And we are all thinking in the same way, and that's crazy. What is absurd for me is that even though we are criticizing the government, but thinking in the same way.
Yeah,
and
no, this was supposed to be your main point, I understand. And I kind of like, I was excited about like interrogating it a little bit with you. And why don't we just Sophie's with us, and everybody just loved her presentation last week. Why don't we just take the chance and take the opportunity and talk to Sophie a little bit, and we can revisit this, because I see JP's here also, and also Klaus is here, so we can maybe like get back to that a little bit later. I don't want to miss a chance to hear from Sophie, because she's very busy and she took a break from work or something to be with us. Sophie, can you speak? There we
Yes,
go.
I can.
Hello.
Hello.
Your screen moved, but yeah,
Always
there we
freezing.
go. I don't know if your signal is good enough to. Hello, nice seeing you.
Yes, now it is. Okay, good, great. Hi everyone. Hi again.
So your last week report from the field really like resonated with a lot of our viewers and our people, our community at the news center. So we thought it would be good if you just update us a little bit with the situation in Boston, with homeless people that you've been involved with. Yeah, so go ahead.
Sure. So, hi, once again, I'm Sophie Lazar. I'm a public health professional. I'm an epidemiologist by training. I currently serve in the role of population health manager, kind of in a program management role at Boston Healthcare for the homeless program. We are a nonprofit clinic affiliated with Harvard Medical School, Boston University Medical School, and Boston Medical Center, which is Boston City Hospital. And it's the largest hospital in Boston that is serving primarily lower income people. Most people know the Boston's hospital system for MGH, Massachusetts General Hospital, and Brigham and Women's Hospital, which are Harvard's teaching hospitals. Boston City Hospital is specifically for those who probably, are lower income, might not have health insurance, as health insurance is not a guarantee in the United States. So we see those patients there. In particular, the clinic that I work with sees the homeless contingent, and there's about 11,000 homeless people in Boston and about 6,000 homeless people who stay in the shelter system in Boston. So in my role, especially before the COVID crisis, I was working on the delivery of healthcare services and the coordination of healthcare services in the shelter setting and on the street for people experiencing homelessness. Just to give a little background, I know I didn't give much background last time. And currently, we're in the midst of responding to the COVID crisis, but that's against the backdrop of us responding to the other crises here, which is the incredibly high cost of living in Boston. Boston is now, I believe, the most expensive city in the United States. And our opiate crisis, which continues to ravage the United States, which has resulted from, in the past 10 years, the overprescription of opiate painkillers. So with both of those things ravaging our homeless community, we have on top of this infectious disease crisis. And currently, we're very blessed in Boston that even though we are a very expensive city, we are not as heavily populated as New York City or Los Angeles or San Francisco. So in our current state right now, we've been very lucky that as a city, composed of a lot of medical professionals, that we took a lot of steps prior to, COVID hitting to be very preventative in action. An example of this is we've set up quarantine and isolation tents. Suffolk University, which is a university in downtown Boston, has given us use of their dormitories as quarantine places for people experiencing homelessness. We have reopened hospitals that had previously been closed as rooms for people experiencing quarantine, which just goes to show that, in my opinion, a lot of the closing of hospitals and as a way to streamline, management was not really a good idea, because when it came down to the outbreak of an infectious disease, we've been seeing basically measures by the government stepping in that really simulate the universal health care that we see in our European neighbors, that, in the United States, make no mistake, even though our government doesn't have universal health care, 60 to 70% of Americans are in favor of this. We've been, we've been pushed down by these major corporations and hospital CEOs, but it doesn't mean that the majority of people are not in favor of universal health care in the United States. And pretty much every movement that we've done, and the ones that have been the most successful in states, have been where the government has stepped in to interfere with this crisis in a way that is giving us more beds, more materials, more protective equipment, because we have some very serious shortages going on in the hospitals. And those alarmist reports coming out of New York City are no joke. We're very lucky in Boston that we are currently in a place where our hospitals are not overcrowded, where we do have bed capacity, but we're expecting the surge in cases to happen in about 2 to 3 weeks in most of the United States. It's hit New York City much faster than the rest of the country, and that's probably because New York City is such a densely populated area. But we will be seeing a lot more mortality and a lot more serious stuff going on about the ventilators, especially in the upcoming weeks. Oh my God, the bidding wars have been really crazy. And I think our governors have been very much in the right here. We're being stymied by the federal government, by their refusal. So in the United States, the president has the ability to enact kind of like a War Powers Act, where they can force industry to produce a needed supply of something in times of crisis. Usually this is enacted during wars, like this was enacted during the Korean War, which was a Cold War proxy war in the 1950s to encourage American industry to produce needed military equipment. Many have called on Trump to enact this power to force the industries like General Motors, our car companies, to make these ventilators. The hospitals are not fighting over them, but that has not happened yet. And at the time being, it's been incredibly stressful because the shortages are false shortages. If we had just enacted, the federal government had really pushed hard.
Your microphone is misbehaving.
Oh, how about now?
Got a little bit better.
Okay. Yeah, sometimes it's shoddy.
Yeah, so tell me something. As an epidemiologist, and this is, I know your opinion, you're not speaking like as the figure of authority, but how do you think this is going to play out? I mean, you said something about like the peak is going to be in 2 weeks in US or something. Can you talk about that? Like, what kind of model is it based on? Is it based on like how this developed in China earlier on, or Italy? Or like Anna was suggesting, it's based on like general information on older epidemics and pandemics. How do you arrive at these models?
So it's a combination of both that's being done in terms of like the statistical analysis. We are really looking at other countries and seeing what is going on in terms of how the epidemic was spreading, looking at the R0, looking at the infectious rate. One thing we noticed, especially in countries like China and Italy, was that this epidemic seems to hit men a lot harder than women. My personal hypothesis about that is because men are more likely to smoke, to use to inhale tobacco products, and as an effect, we've noticed that because this is an upper respiratory disease, anything that's done that compromises the upper respiratory system will have the effect of worsening the outcomes for this epidemic. Sorry, I just gotta grab my charger. And I think, so we've actually been asked by the CDC to keep tabs on the gender disparity in these cases, to see if that data that we're getting from our homeless population is reflecting those larger numbers. We're also doing a lot of case tracking right now. So I basically run around the city of Boston looking for homeless people who've socialized with other homeless people who are currently being tested, who may have tested positive. We go through an intensive tracking period where we're asking people, like, who have you seen in the past 3 days? And, you know, for many of our people, as they're homeless, they're indigent, they're people on the margins of society, and they don't want to tell us who their drug dealer is, but we have to find these people, track them down, and then ask them to voluntarily submit to isolation and quarantine. And it's been a very difficult selling point for people who are very marginalized, who want to cooperate with authorities, especially medical authorities. And many of them even say to us, no, I don't care if I get it, just let me die. What's the point? And so that's been—
I want to ask you one question before, I think Reza also has some questions. My question was like, at what point—
on the modeling of the epidemic, I'm sorry, it's the sounding is off. We're also basing our modeling off New York City's modeling and just seeing how it hit and the pace at which things accelerated, because New York City is more condensed than Boston is. And just seeing the pace of how things were going, our model kind of supposes that we are maybe like 1 to 2 weeks behind New York City.
Interesting you said that. My question was, at what point, because I heard that in New York, they stopped following contacts because it's just too many and too much. At one point, this shifts qualitatively so you can actually go after contacts and you just give up. Because in New York, I don't know if it's true or not, but I heard that they're not doing what you're doing in Boston anymore.
Yeah, I think there's a certain point where the virus reaches a certain like level of saturation in the population that it's futile to do any kind of case tracking, because the assumption is that everyone has been exposed and therefore isolation won't work because the virus is just in the general population. And so we're assuming we're on that trajectory and we're getting there, but we're trying to slow that down by isolating and case tracking as many people as possible. And that's kind of the point of the whole social distancing, is that if we social distance effectively, it makes epidemiologists' jobs a lot easier because there's a lot fewer people that we're isolating and there's a lot fewer avenues of exposure. So at this time, we are still doing case tracking, but we do know that at a certain point, it will not be effective anymore because the virus will have just exposed itself to everyone in the population. And my assumption, based off what I'm hearing from the people I'm working with, because I'm not working very closely with the numbers, I'm really more on the field, is that that's going to be in about 2 to 3 weeks for most of the United States. Even Trump was looking very serious and very somber about this, so maybe
Finally.
he has accepted what we've been saying for many months.
Reza, do you want to?
Yeah.
Your microphone has to be muted, unmuted. And you know,
My
your
apologies.
gesture of
my
defiance,
apologies.
lighting a cigarette when—
What are you doing, smoking?
I know exactly when Sophie said—
To be honest with you, if I don't die of lung cancer, I wouldn't have a good life.
You know, earlier on, Valentin was smoking, and I also saw one of our guests, Darko, was also just like casually smoking, and like, it's like, okay.
Breathing is boring.
Yeah.
Assuming that we will survive long enough.
Even if you don't. So I have a few things to kind of connect Anna's and Sophie's, and thank you so much. Really, you guys have been truly fantastic so far. So
I'm just gonna say one thing though. I don't understand Europeans and their fixture on smoking as an American.
I'm Iranian. I'm not. I'm Iranian. I'm not European.
Yeah, we were colonized by Europe. You know, we European attitude, semi-colonized. Go ahead.
So Anna brought something that I thought was dark, yet somber. That in a time of crisis, we unconsciously act like the government. That is truly, if you really prod through this statement, you see that there is some sort of fundamental fucked upness in it. And something that we haven't just even realized what it means. I think that was the greatest slogan. I think you should go to some sort of mixtape at this point, Corona mixtape. Second, with that regard, I would say that, okay, sure, Germany is now becoming the bastion of intellectualism, and for that matter, it will be, they wouldn't say that Germans produced just Immanuel Kant or Hegel, but they actually took care of their own intellectuals. But following Anna's logic, there would be a sinister scenario. You guys squandered all of that money on fucking artists. Don't you have a shame? Aren't you disgraceful? Well, you are. You could give this money to people in help. You could actually, before this catastrophe kicked in, you could give this money to elementary school teachers. And elementary school teachers in the Western world gets less amounts of a goddamn hairstylist. This is when you know there is something fundamentally wrong.
Reza, I think you hang out with too many rich and famous artists, because the artists we're talking about are like...
I just don't know. I'm talking about me and you, we are basically freelancers. We are poor people.
The artists who are receiving this money are the people you've never heard their name because they never got a show, or they get so few in between.
Why the show matters at this point?
Well, because
why artists matters? Why freelancers matters?
Because all
talking about the scope of something that is beyond our imagination. And if we cannot deal with it and simply say that, oh, well, I got my paycheck, but what about those people who are susceptible?
Can I comment on this a little bit?
Yes, go ahead.
I think that nothing actually have changed. I think that the situation where everyone is isolated, when people are out of work, it was always there. I think the situation when state gives money to corporations, a little bit money, a crumb of money as a treat to artists, it was always there. Like, there is absolutely nothing changed. Like, we always sat at home. We always did like the most interesting international organizing through Zoom. So, I mean, what you Reza are talking about is not a decision to help artists. It's a lack of decision to change anything. It's, as you can see,
that is absolutely true. That is absolutely true.
What government wants to do is to pretend that March did not exist, that April will not exist, that we give exact amount of money. Like what 10 people company gets 15k euro, which is exactly to pay everyone's salary for which
it's like when Jeff Bezos, or for that matter Bill Gates, give some sort of donation to the art world. Well, big deal. Yes, big deal. Yeah,
but I mean,
I completely agree with you. I completely agree.
Time donation, it's the normal amount of donation, the normal amount of money people get. It's not like somebody like government never cared about this particular group of people, but now it suddenly does. Like
Reza's just jealous. Reza's just jealous.
Of course I'm jealous.
Reza's just jealous.
Jealous. Why is that? A bunch of blasé artists who make nothing good art get to survive the coronavirus, while elementary teachers who are old and have retired should die.
Well,
yes.
Reza, I think 500 million given to freelancers and artists who are not all artists, actually. Freelancers are not all artists. is nothing compared to, I mean, we're just replicating government's logic. Now, every time I see Anna,
that's why I said that, Anna, I
right?
thought that when we looked into Anna's statement, it has so many layers. But let's stop it. I want to ask some technical questions from Sophie. You know, so the thing is that, Sophie, people who have been publishing constantly on the Lancet, running statistical models and computational modelings, they came up with two really interesting conclusions. One was that the majority of methods of calculation of R0, basic reproductive number, are in fact based on something called population level modeling, which is basically just simply empirical contact tracing, nothing more, nothing less. And they showed that individual level models, so many of them, can actually simulate the effects of population level modeling of prevalence and incidence of an infection. And hence, we are in the dark with regard to, first, our models. And two, is that as Joel Hellebel's team recently ran extensive stochastic modeling on COVID-19, he noticed that as the R0 increases from 1.5 tending toward 2.5 and beyond, containment is no longer viable. Do you have any answer on or opinion on these things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's completely valid, that at a certain point containment is no longer valid. We kind of missed the boat for that in many ways because we did not move fast enough. There was a lot of kind of like hand holding and kind of, you know, anxiety, but there was not, the action was not put into place swiftly enough, and there were many preventable deaths that were occurring.
Do you think that it was a lack of swiftness, or it was something inevitable?
No, I believe it was the lack of swiftness. I think it's a mistake to kind of put a narrative on any kind of illness and any kind of disease as any kind of metaphor of inevitability. There's plenty in place that we could have done that could have prevented a lot of the deaths that have been occurring. You know, my president, Donald Trump, even stated, oh, we're going to have businesses open by Easter. And the evangelical Christian communities in the United States, which are very intense, very deep, and very widespread, particularly in the southern part of the United States, have not taken this crisis as seriously. In fact, a major pastor, church leader, was arrested because he was continuing to hold these services. I think it would have been a lot more drastic. It would have been a lot more invasive in people's lives, and that's the price that we do have to pay. And I think, you know, you hear a lot of dialogue of, you know, why are we being allowed to die, and also why are our personal liberties being invaded? I can't speak for Europe. In America, personal liberties are like the most like sacred thing for people. You know, if it comes to gun ownership, if it comes to freedom of speech. And so there was some feeling in the United States, well, to really introduce the controls that we need would require almost an abandonment of some of the aspects of American life, to work like South Korea did, or Singapore did, or, you know, Taiwan did. And many people in European countries as well, I can't speak for them, there were aspects that they were just not willing to accept until it came too late, because, you know, I think it goes down to some of the things that I read in college with Foucault and biopower.
Second question for you before I have one more question after this, and then I will retire. I have to go. Thank you so much for all of your insights. My second question to you would be, you know, how much of this, if you say that, okay, they were blasé and they were basically acting not swiftly, how much of the slowness of the response do you blame it on faulty models which scientists were using, like applying, for example, MERS or SARS to COVID-19? Like, for example, Ferguson, you know, in London, who conducted, you know, it was just basically using, just overstretching the old models to a new phenomenon.
I mean, it's a really difficult question because, you know, with the modeling, you know, we'll never be able to predict. And there was you know, what we do know, what we've always known since the 1918 epidemic is there's going to be another flu epidemic. It was going to hit at some point, and people had been monitoring this. And there was that feeling about SARS, that was that feeling about swine flu, H1N1, that feeling about MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And with this one, you know, I think the problem wasn't even that there was faulty modeling, but that some of the modeling that was done, particularly in China, was being repressed by the Chinese government and was very difficult to disseminate outside of the Chinese mainland. And so by the time we were getting what we assumed to be accurate numbers, it was already too late, because it was very hard to trust the numbers coming out of China, because we knew that whatever was coming out might have had some, you know, doctoring.
Gerrymandering, biological gerrymandering.
Something of that nature, because it's very hard to trust data that comes out of countries where peer review processes might be stymied by government interventions. So, or interference, I should say. So it was very difficult to really accurately assess how serious the models were going to be. Another thing is that, you know, each population is so different, and the resources are themselves so different, that, you know, a lot of the words that were coming out was, this is really going to affect older people and people with immunocompromised states, diabetes, cancer treatments, lupus, and
heart conditions. Yes.
So this might have given many people a false sense of security, because they didn't realize that the other side of this is that when the complications do hit, and they are very intense for the upper respiratory system, the needed interventions like ventilators, if everyone is trying to access them at the same time, it does lead to unnecessary suffering and unnecessary death. And so the model of spreading, you know, of this flattening the curve is a very good model and a very effective one. It's just very difficult to implement it if the public buy-in is not where it needs to be. And I think initially there was poor public buy-in, because the message getting out was, you know, this is only going to affect old people. And, you know, our generation in the United States, who are old people, we call them the boomers. They were the people who were active in radical politics in the 1960s in many ways. They were the ones going to Woodstock. And I often thought maybe it's harder for them. You know, my father is a type 1 diabetic. He's had diabetes his entire life. And honestly, sometimes I think it's harder for him to accept that he's old more than it is for him to accept that he could have this infectious disease. And so there was a reckoning generationally that this generation of flower power and hippies are old and they're vulnerable. And that's been very difficult, I think, for the older generation to self-quarantine in my country, at least. I don't know how it is felt in Europe or, you know, anywhere else in the world.
Let me just like focus Reza's question. So basically what I'm getting from listening to you converse is that we're dealing with like these two competing models of the modeling of the illness. The earlier, which was sort of like inaccurate based on SARS and other epidemics, and hence the slow response and thinking, oh, it's only old people, oh, it's only like flu. And then when the reality of the data coming in from China and other places hit and new models are developed, and then all of a sudden the entire Western world goes from like, because we went from German government saying groups more than 1,000 people are not allowed, to overnight or almost 48 hours, they said group more than 2. So like going from 1,000 to 2 means a huge shift in how you understand the illness. So these two different modeling systems, the way they were modeling it, really like were incompatible. And then finally Trump yesterday said, sure, April 20th. I guess now even Trump understands the new model, right? Or the new modeling, sorry.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, I think there's also a case where they don't want to cause a panic in society, because that is an issue with the allocation of resources. For instance, the second there was concern, immediately the cost of toilet paper shot up. You know, shelves are emptied. It is a case.
That's unfortunately Europe, a Western problem, though. That doesn't happen in Asia. As long as you have a bidet hose, you are safe.
So we have a lot to learn from Asia, I would say.
Reza, we have a.
Oh, the final question that I have to ask from Sophie. My apologies, my true apologies. And my apologies to Sophie for keeping you. So there are actually emerging memes right now. Ventilator or Campbell soup?
Or what soup?
Campbell soup. Campbell soup.
Oh, ventilator.
Ventilator or Campbell soup?
Ventilator.
Which one? Which one do you go for?
A ventilator.
I would go with Campbell soup.
I don't know the meme.
Fortunately.
So, you know, I've been working nonstop, so I've been missing out on the internet culture, but I would hope that people would choose ventilator.
I'm a boomer. I don't follow internet, but the question is essentially revolving around this. So there is a hard-hitting crisis, COVID-19, which deprives us of medical instruments, so on and so forth. But then there is a second wave of onslaught yet to come. And that wave is far worse. Do you really want to be deprived of canned foods while there is no fresh food anymore?
I don't know if you're setting up a fair argument.
But that is going to happen. It's a war situation 101.
In the United States, we have, I think the federal government told us they had stockpiled 650 million pounds of chicken. So I think we'll be okay.
Sophie, please go on Amazon, Whole Food, all sorts of delivery. See if there is anything available at this point.
So is that a logistics problem or is that an agricultural problem?
Logistic problem.
Yeah, I think I would call on people to start planting seeds and start gardening and raising their own.
Oh my God, Chris and my wife has already bought so many seeds. I said, what? You know, you are not going to grow these things for the next year.
Reza, we have a special guest in the room. He can only be with us for a few minutes.
Okay, my apologies. Love you to all. I have to go.
I wish you would stay for Colin, because Colin will be interested.
Okay, I will stay for
You got to stay for Colin, because Colin's going to be starting to teach a seminar on MMT, modern monetary theory, this Saturday. And it's a discussion that's happening both around like democratic socialism and Green New Deal and how we're going to afford that, and now about how to deal with the economic outcome of COVID. And it also, maybe we can put Colin and Anna, because Colin's both a political theorist, but also a philosopher. So maybe him and Anna can maybe resolve that problem, the epistemological problem of us in a moment of crisis, having no other way of responding. We would just copy or replicate the way government looks at the problem, and then, which is basically resources, money. So Colin, do you want to like take over and sort of like talk about what do you think there is, if there's any relationship between what you've been kind of studying and what people around the world have been studying and calling MMT and the current COVID pandemic? And how do you see this?
Well, I mean, we can begin by thinking about this dichotomy that was presented between ventilators and Campbell's soup. I mean, my question here is, what resources do those things compete for? I mean, maybe like a little bit of aluminum, but mostly, I mean, there is no trade-off between Campbell's soup and ventilators because they don't use the same resources. I mean, aluminum and labor, I think, are the only resources that I can think of that both of those things consume. So part of what's useful about MMT is reframing. You know, I mean, people have we have a tendency to think of money as a substance, and to think about like, you know, trade-offs between buying one thing and buying another thing is, you know, we think that money is transmuted into the thing that we buy. This is our sort of naive folk belief. But, you know, I mean, part of the virtue of MMT is to refocus the limits of monetary systems as being limited by real resources instead of kind of politically imposed fiscal constraints. I don't know. I think that'd be one way to begin. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things happening in the development of the financial system, which can be analyzed from a MMT informed perspective, but are not necessarily MMT. So I'm not sure exactly what I can talk about those things.
I'll just explain something. For instance, earlier on we were talking how the state, because Berlin is a state, right? It's a big city. It's like a state. So the Berlin Senate approved $500 million to be handed out to freelancers, including artists, right? And they were very lax in letting that money go. Like you just had to go put your name and your tax number and say if you won the 5,000 or not. And 24 hours later, you receive 5,000 euro in your bank account, like literally, like less than 24 hours. Some people got it less than 24 hours. Some people got up to 15,000 euro, depending on number of people they hire and what they do and all that, right? So basically for my first way of understanding was like, oh, this is similar to MMT because they're not worrying about inflation or they're not worrying about what this $500 million does to the state of Berlin. But they just think if we put this money in people's pockets, at least it'll like not only take care of their needs, but it will help restart something from the bottom up. But that's just like my naive, curatorial, artistic way of saying things. So I thought maybe it would be good to sort of like ask that. And then Anna complicated that by talking about how this way of looking at the problem is exactly like replicating a government epistemology. Now we're replicating it. Now we're thinking about our problems the way the government thinks about the problems. So then this is where you come in, and I'm trying to like see your insights.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. So I think the way to begin attacking this problem is to say that it is MMT, but it is not in very important ways, right? So I've seen this discourse circulating, and especially so that the Federal Reserve is engaging in some kind of non-standard interventions of various kinds, and I've seen this meme going around, this proves MMT right, or we're all MMT now, or something like this. But I actually think that discourse is a little bit disingenuous, and the reason that this is so is that the policy that would be advocated by the MMT perspective is not a like supply side funding intervention, right? So there's a fundamental difference which is being elided by this discourse between supply side and demand side interventions. And so, I mean, so really the reason that people are being handed money, and especially, and the reason that they're, well, the German government is smarter than the U.S. government in this, that they're willing to give it to informally employed people. They're trying to roll over a rent crisis. I mean, the problem is that if nobody can go to their jobs, if artists can't work and they can't pay their rent, now you're going to start seeing the value of investment properties collapse. And so they're trying to shovel money into the bottom of the system in order to roll over a rent crisis. But this is not exactly the same thing as the state mobilizing resources directly through its fiscal power, right? So, I mean, and so like what we're seeing is the Federal Reserve saying, yeah, okay, we can't run out of money. We actually control the magic money machine. We'll admit this. But what we're going to do is we're only going to think about what we can use this power to do in order to change the funding, the price of funding for private firms, right? So they're saying we're going to buy corporate paper through the power of the Federal Reserve in order to lower their interest rates. All of this based on the idea that if you can just lower the interest rates low enough, then private firms will start doing stuff that we need them to do. What
but that didn't work in 2008.
Yes, right. So the issue is that 2008, I mean, it kind of did work in 2008 from their perspective, because 2008 was just a liquidity crisis that emerges from inside. It's endogenous to the financial system. The only shock of 2008 was the shock of discovering that mortgage originators weren't doing diligence with their paperwork, or the shock of discovering that like people with no jobs and no income can't pay their mortgage. I mean, this is not a real, but the coronavirus is shutting down the global supply chain, which is exogenous shock, and it's a very, very different sort of thing. And the problem is that in this post-2008 epistemological moment, the global elites have spent the last 10 years believing that all they have to do is throw money into the banking system and they can solve any problem whatsoever. And you now have kind of this idea in the United States that the Federal Reserve is going to fight a pandemic. The Federal Reserve doesn't employ any doctors. I mean, like you can't fight a pandemic just by lowering the interest rate in order to incentivize private firms. I mean, you need the government to spend money in order to mobilize real resources at the point of demand. And so that's an important distinction between MMT and anything else. So I think it's important to insist that this is not exactly a kind of MMT policy response, even though it does abandon this fantasy that money is a real resource that we're constrained by. I mean, there's another aspect to it.
So now this like ability, so this sort of like ability of banks to borrow up to $1 trillion a day from the Federal Reserve, how close that is to some kind of like you know how they say socialism for rich people, how close that is to like MMT for banks and rich people? Saying like we're going to lend you $1 trillion a day. I mean, that's crazy.
Right. I mean, it is. I mean yes. I mean, there is no constraint of monetary scarcity when we're talking about this, but sort of, you know, the point of MMT is to say, look, I mean, they've revealed the truth of the system, but them just doing more of that is not what we are asking for from an MMT perspective. We're saying.
Maybe we can agree that like at least this part of this epistemological shift is that they reveal the truth of the monetary system by lending banks that, or even a little bit like by putting $500 million in 2 days in the pocket of freelancers. Even though the bank one is much closer to showing the working of the system than the second one, because María, who was here earlier, made a claim. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, that like German state sits on a lot of taxes. This is just like basically, this is not money they're printing, it's the money they have. And they're hoping to somehow recover it by looking at how you spend this 5,000 and how this help your business, and you actually might have to give it back once they do their auditing. So it's basically like, okay, take some of this money right now, we'll count it later, and we get it back from you later. It's not necessarily MMT. Well,
I mean, the whole thing is they need to desperately try to preserve the illusion that that money is constrained in this way. I mean, it's an emergency. They have to give it up, but they have to, they're worried about what happens afterwards. I mean, 2000 was bad enough. I mean, 2008 created MMT it's not the beginning of MMT, but it's the beginning of MMT as a publicly relevant discourse. I mean, that was bad enough, and that was nothing compared to and so they desperately have to try to prove to maintain this illusion.
So Reza, Valentin, Reza, Valentin.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for Colin for superb presentation. Just before I retire, a couple of things. When you say that there is not a fundamental, and I hope I did not misappropriated your words, and please do tell me if I have. When you said that there is no fundamental distinction between a ventilator and Campbell's soup, I would say that yes, there is. You see, yes, they are both made of certain kinds of materials. First level distinction is that just because it has aluminum doesn't mean that it doesn't have veggies inside it. Right, the Campbell's soup slogan. Second, the most important problem here is that we are in a time of crisis where people make miscalculations with regard to prioritizations. One day, ventilators come first. Another day, Campbell's soup come first. And that creates a real difference between these two things in the long run.
Colin, you're muted.
Maybe unmute yourself. Sorry. Colin, you're mute. Can you unmute Colin? Yes. There we go. Go ahead.
Okay. I don't think that's the case. There's only a trade-off if we believe that there's some kind of we have to
trade-offs. Trade-offs are merely symptoms of the policy making. Trade-offs in for example, in bigger states are not actually trade-offs in the sense of game theoretic trade-offs, or for that matter, rational trade-offs. There are trade-offs by virtue of policy making, and policy making is biased, as always.
I think the point is that policy making involves creating the illusion of trade-offs where they don't exist. Policy
trade-off is always necessary. Trade-off is always necessary. At the time
no, it's only
crisis.
Contingently necessary if there's an actual trade-off. Yeah, if there's a question of we're running out of aluminum, then I have to decide what I want to use the aluminum for. But tomatoes don't go in ventilators. So putting tomatoes into cans doesn't constrain anybody's ability to create ventilators.
No, tomatoes in aluminum are actually food for people.
Yeah, but I think what Reza's trying to say is that at some point, government will make this a trade-off and say, okay, basic needs are more important than saving lives. So we're gonna just shift to like making canned food. Than
we had really great discussions
because Colin's got a lot of stuff to say. So
we had great discussions last session where people brought up the idea of triage in the sense that, we are going to make trade-offs at this point, and we are not going to be sub rosa about it. We are going to actually say that, okay, this is contingent plan Z, not plan B, plan Z. We are going, if you are above 60, if you have underlying conditions, sorry, you don't get a ventilator at this point.
Well, do you think you deserve a ventilator because you're a smoker? You do something, you don't have to
smoke and you choose to smoke and that puts you higher at risk.
I am an
Good
Iranian.
question. Very good
I am
question.
an Iranian. My lung is bigger than yours.
I'm a Ukrainian, I mean American Ukrainian, so I don't know.
So you have,
But,
a little bit of
Reza, I
genetic
really want to get back
share
to
with
what Colin was
Iranians.
saying. Colin, go ahead. You know what I mean? Interrogate Reza's notion of trade-off because it's productive.
Yeah, some trade-offs exist and other trade-offs don't exist. I mean, I'm not denying that the existence of trade-offs. I'm saying that money is not something that in itself creates trade-offs inherently, ontologically.
No, money doesn't. Like absolutely, I completely agree.
So in
not.
what way? Okay, so there is a trade-off. And there's 1,000 sick people, and I have 100 ventilators, then there is a real scarcity. There is a constraint. Yes, I mean, I must do triage on the people to decide who gets a ventilator. But if I'm deciding whether I want to build more ventilators or more cans of Campbell's soup, then there's only a trade-off insofar as there's an actual scarcity at play there. I mean, there's not. The point is that there is not a trade-off.
How is that a scarcity?
Money.
How is that a scarcity? I mean, haven't
scarcity
you
of what?
really looked at the rate by which the food resources from deliveries are dwindling?
I've been stockpiling dry goods for a month. I'm well aware.
Yeah, well,
of the
you
supply
are a true survivalist. So as me, we didn't rush. We didn't rush to this game. We didn't hoard. We actually were prudent because we know what was at stake. But nevertheless, for those people who didn't do that, they get into the trade-off.
But Reza, you're asking an economic question.
Yeah.
I'm actually asking a game theoretic question.
Even then, it's an economic question.
With a payoff function.
But Colin is right here. There's nothing connecting soup cans and ventilators except for aluminum and maybe some other precious metal that could be reallocated.
I would say that give it time and the complicity between anonymous materials will unfold.
Okay, so Colin, can you stick around or you have to go? Because
one more from Colin. Colin was so good.
Okay, Reza, only if you allow him to respond and don't cut him off. Because
yes, I promise. Okay? Yes. Okay.
Otherwise, I'll just get Kasra to cut you off. If you do it twice, we kick you out of the room. Seriously.
Yes. So, Colin, what do you actually think about Germany's response to the crisis?
Of giving everybody five grand?
Yeah, for instance, like this one thing you learn, but like they're giving a lot to a lot of other people too.
Yeah. Do you think it's wise? Is it necessary? Or is a certain kind of quick fix?
I can't really think of anything argument against it. It's not, I can't think of an argument against it. I mean, the question would be, is that all you need to do? No, probably not. I mean, you need to, the point that I'm just going to harp on is that the government has to mobilize resources directly in order to acquire non-financial assets that hedge strategic risk. The point is that there's no way that like imminently within the financial system that you can deal with a pandemic. You have to actually have real non-financial assets like hospitals and ventilators and stuff like this. But as far as like, is there an argument against handing everybody money in order to prevent a collapse of the payment system? I don't really think so. The only argument that I could see that would be an argument against this is if it's like, instead of something that would be more radical that we might want. For example, if we're using this in order to roll over rent payments, and what we would rather do is convert all renters into owners of their apartments by decree, okay, maybe that's an argument against this. But on the face of it, there's no strong argument for like why this is a terrible thing to do, to just hand people money. It seems.
So if that is so, do you think that this might actually verge upon, after this whole calamity is over, if it is over, that it might verge on something like universal basic income?
Seems like it. I mean, it might be hard to put that genie back in the bottle. I mean, but I mean, I'm not, you know, UBI is not I think a great policy. But I don't know that it's the end of the world if that's where this goes. I mean,
Colin, can I ask you why you don't think UBI is a great policy?
Because I think it relies upon a narrative according to which like there is an obsolescence of like human work. It relies upon this idea that like technological employment is sort of this inevitable trajectory. Whereas I sort of look at the world and I see an enormous amount of work that needs to be done. And so I think rather than say, yes, people are useless, we need to pay. I think there's an enormous amount of like publicly useful work that we could fund people to do. And so I don't really, and the other thing, so that's one reason, is that thinking about UBI is kind of as a consequence. If I see people who are like dependent on UBI and sort of who are, if the Constitution, our society recognizes that these people are useless, there's no publicly good things for them to do, we're just going to feed them, that seems like a group of people who are powerless and whose power is going to be eroded over time. And it seems likely to me that, so like the question is, what is the real value of this UBI? You need to, in order to maintain it as something that is sort of like a permanent constitutional feature of a society, you need to define in terms of real goods. I mean, what are you supposed to get for this UBI? And so I think those are additional questions. I mean, I have not been an advocate of UBI. I prefer the job guarantee politics to UBI politics, but at the same time, I don't know that it's necessarily the end of the world if where COVID goes, now we have UBI.
As you know, our common friend here in Berlin, Dimitri used to call a new concept called like universal basic outcome, which basically is sort of like basically sound like universal basic services. So instead of giving cash, you make sure that everyone gets food for free, healthcare for free, education for free, and rent for free. So if you and then if you get all of these, you don't need UBI because you have the outcomes, you know?
Yeah.
Sorry, my video is off. You don't need the income because that's where your money goes anyways.
Yeah, I think Dimitri is right about this. I mean, the point is that in order to make UBI work, you already have to make it universal basic outcome, because the problem is how do you define the real value of the? I mean, look, in introducing UBI as a permanent feature of the social contract is going to create a price revolution. Nobody's going to know. Like, inflation is not bad in itself. Like, it's okay, but it's going to change the prices of everything. It's going to be a price revolution. And the question is, like, once the dust of that settles, what are you supposed to be able to buy for your UBI? There's a without like expounding on this, there's a deep philosophical problem about the idea of real value in economics. It's not at all clear that real value exists, can be objectively defined. Like, nominal values exist. There are, their nominal values are written on contracts and receipts and stuff. But in terms of like, what is the real value of this money over time? It's a deep question. It's a political question. And it's a question that has to be answered if you're going to make UBI into more than an emergency measure as it's being used right now. I mean, and so the point is that in order to make basic income work, it already has to be universal basic outcome, because you need to define what the real value of it is. And so if you're going to do that, it's not clear why that's a superior strategy than the direct provision of basic services.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you can stay with us longer, if you want to like do your work and come back, but like we'll be here for, I don't know, we're supposed to end in like 10 minutes, but I think I really want to take Klaus's take. Klaus is also teaching a seminar with us right now, Problem of Narrative Visual Arts. And I see a lot going on here that deals with narrative. And actually Sophie at one point talked about like the disease does not have a narrative, or let's not narrativize this illness, right? And I thought, okay, Klaus would be the right person to discuss that. So what do you think, Klaus? Would you like to speak to that? And maybe, yeah.
Yeah, sure. No, I do think that there's really a few points that have to do with narratives concerning this situation. And I think there's something special about the corona narratives as opposed to more traditional narratives. where narrative is not defined as big narrative, but rather simply as the representation of a chain of events over time. Okay, so in this sense, first there's the question of how we narrate this epidemic. And this radically affects how we react, of course. Do we narrate this in terms of a specific origin or in terms of a global destiny? So like future facing or like past facing? Do we narrate the response in terms of war or in terms of an economic crisis? An economic crisis or a health crisis, or rather which of these narratives becomes the main narrative that like determines how we make trade-offs, which becomes the primary narrative, and how does this shift over time? This will strongly determine our choices. Then there's a second point, which I think makes this distinct from more traditional narratives. Most traditional narratives tend to be retrospective. They tell you about events that happened. Here, most of the narratives that we care about tend to be predictive. So we take what we've learned about the past, and we try to make predictions based on that. The third point that makes them different seems to be that traditional narratives are mainly about the specific, about the one case, this person, what happened to them, right? Where this one is really about, you know, blueprints or templates, about the generic. And this, I think, has to do with the idea of corona or the virus erasing borders, as Feldman has also suggested last week. A fourth point of difference is that I think it changes the criteria for tellability. That's a bit of a smaller point, but what becomes tellable in times of corona is very different than from what is tellable in normal times. Suddenly, like minute events, you will tell your friends about that. So there are all these things that suddenly in this, especially linked to the quarantine, become tellable. And then there's a fifth point, I think, which is very specific, is that on one level, there are statistics informing the narratives, especially these predictive narratives. But on another, there's a competition between statistics and narratives, especially in people's minds. So these are like
how do you formulate that? Because like for me, this thing you say is like, I go to the counter, the death counter is like this, like whatever it's called, worldometer, and really like looking at those numbers, I can just see how like hypotheses or like the continuation of this like really boring sci-fi TV show we've been stuck in goes on for me. It's like that number is very important for my own narrativization of the illness. Sorry, Sophie, as bad as it is. I don't know if you want to like come back and tell us what you meant by illnesses don't have narratives. But yeah, so what do you think of this relationship between statistics and stories and narrative?
Me or Sophie?
Maybe Sophie can clarify what she said about narratives, because it's gonna like anchor the conversation a bit.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Is
you.
my screen okay, not frozen? All right, great. It might be frozen, but
it's not.
I think what I was really referring to was more something I've seen a little bit in social media, which is the tendency to apply a kind of eugenics narrative to corona, like, oh, it's killing the older folks who in, the United States at least, are more conservative. So we should greet this as, in our favor, or, this is an ecological win because it's killing the people and the planet is being allowed to breathe, so to speak. I think that it's a very dangerous narrative in that sense. And that's also a narrative that has been used in terms of to advocate for like population control of like, oh, let the disease kill who it's going to kill because the earth needs, to come to some ecological place there. And I think that that's a very unfair narrative to impose because it ignores the fact that the wealthy will ultimately survive this pandemic in their bunkers, and the people who are exposed who will die because they were not given the correct treatment or protections. So yeah, it's this kind of like fascist, leftist, almost like enviro-fascist narrative I've been reading about. That's where I was saying, don't put that narrative on this illness. I think in general, though, it is helpful to look for some narratives, but I think there's a danger in over-predicting just over predicting, you know, what the course of events may be as being kind of preordained in some sense. I see someone saying fascist, leftist. Yes, exactly that.
Okay, so Klaus, you want to kind of like use that, and so you're talking about sort of like how these narratives are developed in order to push policy or public opinion in a certain way, right? And everyone's sort of like engaging in it. But I guess not all narratives are bad here, right?
I mean, yeah, we had this discussion with Emmy Fu, who brought it up in the chat before, saying that there's also narratives used to read these events. Kind of the narratives pre-exist, and then we have this event, and now we look at them through these narratives. So narratives becoming kind of glasses for reading these events. So that's one thing, and that's, I think, what Sophie is pointing at. So do you kind of activate a survival of the fittest narrative and apply that to how you read what not only happens, but what should happen? It's kind of awkward as well, because narrative.
I'll give you one example, right? Like what I've been kind of thinking is that, and this is sort of like an epiphany to me, right? Like after last week's, when I brought up the fact that like Spanish flu history is not written into Iranian history, even though 20% of the Iranian population was wiped out by the Spanish flu in the early 20th century. Then after the session, me and Kasra sort of like went on a research thing, and then we realized that the year that Spanish flu did the most damage, and basically the last year of the big, it was a 3-year thing. It was in a Persian calendar, it was the year 1299. And it was the last year of the old monarchic system, Qajar, which was a very traditional monarchy. They were in power for like around 400 years. They really are the source of Iran kind of like falling behind. I mean, if Reza was here, he could just tell you. And also like the kind of like basically they open up the political, they open up the court to like influence by French and Russian and British embassies, and those people were in charge, and the central government fell apart. They were like overtly religious and overtly corrupt. And basically 1299, the King Reza Shah took over and sort of like began this program of modernity. Now, 100 years later, at the year 1399 in Iran, another pandemic like that is totally like ravaging society and actually showing how incompetent the Islamic Republic has been in the last 40 years. So a lot of Iranians are kind of like making this parallel narrative between Spanish flu 1299 and COVID-19 1399. Of course, I'm talking about Iranian calendar. The Persian year just switched to 1399. So this like we got tons of like pre-centennial tensions going on already. Everyone thinking what's going to happen in the year 1400 Iranian calendar. So yeah, so this is sort of like a kind of a narrative, parallel narrative, that people are going back to history and kind of like putting the two together, you know? And I really hope that this is gonna like follow like that other narrative where like in this year, this system, I hate to call it regime, because every time you say regime, you know the bombs are coming next, right? So you just call it a system, right? The Iranian system really needs an overhaul, and maybe this is sort of like the narrative that I want to come out of this, at least locally in Iran, you know?
Yeah.
I think for it to be like a narrative of, you know, epic tales that we tell later, there needs to be some kind of a change in opportunity. And like with Spanish flu, as you told, with Great Depression in US, it was an opportunity for government to, you know, get stuff together and maybe implement some policies, some public policies to lift things apart. But on the individual level, as Klaus noticed, you know, there is a big like rise in like individual personal narrative, which are actually nothing new. This is like everyone is doing thrice as many selfies. This is just purely a quantitative change. To make sure for us, for people who kind of want some kind of change, like bigger than, you know, maybe hopefully Boris Johnson will implement some policies, there needs to be something else apart from what is going on right now to kind of make sure it's a narrative. Because I'm afraid 20 years down the line, there's going to be a story about governments dealing with it in a good way, in a bad way, but it's not going to be in individual stories. There's going to be like, yes, in this 4 months, I rediscovered yoga and then I forgot about it. In these 4 months, I got super poor and my neighbor punched me and then we forgot about this. Like, this is just intensification of whatever it is on individual level was happening. On the government level, it's an opportunity. On individual level, it's far from this. It's only getting harder to organize, only getting easier to be on social network. It's there's something missing for it to be individually relevant.
I mean, in this sense, I would suspect that we have a bit of a bias because most of us, I suspect, are knowledge workers. And so for us, the change is not all that big because we're already most of the time sitting at home in front of a computer thinking. But for someone who every day is used to go out and do something, I think the cut is much more strong. So I would be maybe more careful in terms of how big of a change that actually can represent for different individuals. But if I can just follow up again on 2 points that Mo mentioned. The first being this idea of people in Iran reading this in terms of the earlier changes that came about, and even the magical thinking involved with this like turn of the century thing. I mean, what's interesting about that, I think, is that believing that there's some kind of repetition of history can make you bring about that history, right? It can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people think, wow, this is this same opportunity that they had at that time, then maybe it becomes that opportunity. So narratives are constructing, are actually developing in and co-constructing reality in that sense and bring people to action. But also this other thing you mentioned, that we all read the statistics and think, how does this affect my life? Where I said in one respect, narratives also oppose statistics. In the way it opposes, for me, I think, okay, so like the way, there are 2 things. Like one way it opposes the statistics is when you see, okay, there is like in most of these sicknesses of coronaviruses, we have an antibody, we have antibodies formed. And then you hear like of 2 cases where people apparently were negative and then positive again. And then like suddenly these 2 cases become more salient than the statistics. Or you have say the knowledge that statistically people under 30 don't die. And then you learn that people that were 16 or 18 and 14 died. And then suddenly this becomes competing to the statistical information, and I think in some cases becomes more salient for people's actions than the knowledge that is produced based on statistics. So that's how I think they're competing, and of course how it informs it is that the statistics seem to tell us what is going to happen next. I mean, that's one source of information. So one source of how we predict, how we generate predicted narratives, and Sophie did it before when she said, well, Boston is 2 weeks behind New York. She kind of used a second source of information, which is the narrative coming out of New York. How did things develop there? And we think now like that New York is the past of Boston, where China was the past of the US, even though some people thought that somehow the US would magically be different. And where people say, well, Austria could be the future of Italy, and so on and so forth. And then there's even this Italian writer who wrote notes from the future, I think, to French people, published in a French journal. And she said, so that's what we first did in the quarantine. This is what we now did. Now we reread all the books, and now we're starting to watch the movies. And so even psychologically, like people are starting to play this game of like, I can predict your future because I live in a country that already went through your future, which is our past. So that's this, and then this prediction happens on an individual level, also in terms of the illness. So what are the first symptoms? There are people who go talk on television, how the symptoms develop, and then we like check whether we have these symptoms at the beginning of the meeting. Like everybody was, I had this cough, and then you go and do I also have a loss of smell? So loss of smell seems to be the trending symptom right now. People start, oh, loss of smell is a big symptom. Do I still smell as good as before? And so as well as before. So there's the personal narrative that comes through the history of symptoms, and then there's the collective narrative, of course, how the infection develops over time within a population. Yeah, so these are some of the aspects that I found important in terms of these narrativities.
Awesome. So, Anna, would you like to get some response to all this? You've been very quiet. You want to turn your microphone off? Yeah.
Yeah, no, so
oh, but by the way, Anna's also teaching a seminar for us right this moment. I think it's the second or the third session on the
no, I think we are kind of a sixth.
Oh my God, sorry. It's just like, you don't know how many days are passing, right? Like I'm still like in early March, I guess, right? Yeah, so it's on the question of dialectics. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, so I was wondering about, there was this epidemic flu in 1968. Nobody remember because nobody took any measure. And 1 million people died all over the world. And 100,000 in the US.
Yeah.
And many, many people died also in France. I don't remember exactly how many, but a lot. And I'm in a list, and there was a doctor who was very many hospitals in Paris in the 68, and he told the story about corpses which were everywhere in the hospital. They couldn't bury them because they were too much. It was 1968. Nobody remember because nobody was locked in and no measures were taken. And so people died and there are no narratives, nothing. It has been forgotten. And
so
my question is why?
Yeah, so
what is telling to us? And I think
globalization is much more intense, and with the spread of social media, things go around, and then just general sensitivity towards crisis and anxieties that we have in the early 21st century, maybe is a reason. But I'm only just like saying what comes to my top of my head, and maybe other people have better clues as to what accounts for. Maybe Sophie just turned her microphone on.
I can talk a little bit about the 1968, well, it's called the Hong Kong flu. It actually only killed 100,000 people in the United States. It did kill 1 million people worldwide. And one of the major modes of transmission was during the Vietnam War, which was, at its peak, so to speak, then. But one of the reasons why it wasn't as deadly, I think it had like a case fatality rate of like 0.5, was because it was an avian flu, and it was a strain of influenza that had been circulating around since the 1957 pandemic, which was the other big pandemic. And so there were a lot of already people in the world who had antibodies for this disease. And then generally, antibiotics were quite effective in managing some of the bacterial infections that were related to this outbreak in particular. It's definitely one thing that people have been looking at and modeling in conjunction with this epidemic, but I think it's a little bit different just because the strain of that flu was similar to other flus in the past, and it hit much later in the year, in the dead of winter. So it just didn't have as much capacity to spread around. That was what I've...
But that doesn't account for how it was kept in the historical imagination or in sort of like popular culture, right?
That's very true. Speak to this, wise ones.
Okay, so we're almost close to sort of like the end of the program. We said we're not going to stick around for 4.5 hours, but I think we got some of our guests here, like Colin, Klaus, Anna, and if you have some question in an orderly manner, maybe we can ask some questions, I think Sean Chappelle had some questions he wanted to ask from Sophie. And Akin wanted to ask something earlier, but I think he already did that. And yeah, so also like we have a special guest in the house, which is Defne Ayas, a lovely board member, and my neighbor. She lives literally like 5 minutes down the street from me, but we haven't been able to see each other. So I don't know if Defne wants to talk, but if not, we can definitely try to ask some questions from people. Sean, do you want to ask your question from Sophie or not? Sean from Canada, Vancouver. He's got some obscuring stuff on his lens, and he's.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. I've got this idea where in the downtown east side here, there's a lot of addicts. I live here and I work here. And there's a lot of people, most addicts are deeply rooted in conspiracy theories, etc. And they have a real deep-seated distrust of the government, and rightly so, conspiracy or not, but they are not adhering to this social distancing at all. I think there's going to be an absolute just explosion of sickness in the community, especially since every single addict has a compromised immune system. I know that didn't sound like a question.
That's absolutely correct. It's something that we've been attempting to mitigate in Boston, where we have a very serious use epidemic here in terms of the substance use here. And I think it's very important to remember that when people are in the throes of addiction, nothing matters but the addiction, and making sure that access to treatment services are not hindered by COVID has been really crucial, making sure that there are still treatment beds open to send patients to. Additionally, I'm not sure what the laws are in Canada as they pertain to forceful hospitalization, but we have certain laws right now enacted in Massachusetts where if someone does test positive for COVID, they cannot refuse treatment, and our National Guard has been activated for this purpose, which is quite controversial, but is something that is happening worldwide and has a lot of historical precedence for. I would say, we have a long history in my organization of making significant inroads with the homeless community to build trust across the medical providers. And I know you have the benefit of having the legalized MAT, medication-assisted treatments like Suboxone and methadone. And I think you can even prescribe heroin or morphine in your country. And that's something that, in the United States, we don't have the benefit of doing that. And it's really interrupted our ability to isolate and quarantine people. So finding creative ways to quarantine that do not disrupt people's use breaks has been the most effective method for us.
If for an addict, the number one priority is the drugs and not the pandemic, why don't you hand them what they need in terms of drugs so they can relax, and then maybe they take the pandemic seriously after they know they can receive the drug from you. So then you can say, okay, now you really have to stay here. And they will
You should run for Congress in the United States, because that's exactly what should be done. But it's not something that legislators are willing to accept, because it means a significant paradigm shift in how drugs are conceptualized in the United States. And unfortunately, as things are going right now, many of our substance users are feeling the burden of COVID because their usual ways of coping with their disease, with their drug addiction, have been sidelined. For instance, they're unable to attend meetings like Narcotics Anonymous groups or peer support groups. They're unable to go for their daily methadone dose, and they've been giving them out monthly, but there's a lot of risk for diversion there, like selling the substance.
That is not good, because people can OD, right? If you give them, if an addict is given more than what they need, they might OD, right? Rather than save it for next day. But
not with medication-assisted treatments, not like Suboxone or methadone, but certainly if they were being prescribed heroin, that would be a risk, or another kind of opiate, that's definitely a risk. So that's one thing that we're really trying to piece together, is how do we make quarantine and isolation suitable for people who are in very serious, addiction right now. So whether it's alcohol, for which the withdrawal process is incredibly dangerous and needs to be monitored, or for benzodiazepines, like Jordan Peterson, for instance, is much in the throes of a benzo situation. We're having to monitor these things, as well as monitor for the flu, as well as monitor for COVID, as well as try to entice people to stay and receive treatment and not lose them to follow-up. So it has been a very delicate balancing act, and we're very lucky that the state has been so cooperative, but it's not true across the United States.
No, this is in no way sort of like a snarky comment or like a joke, but even in Berlin, it's known for like a high level of recreational drug use, right?
Yeah.
Party, nightclub. One of the first things everyone did after this was to run and buy as much recreational drug as possible in order to be able to comply with social distancing. So it's like, okay, if I'm going to be home, I really need to get my supplies, and then I can just stay home and do my drugs at home. So it was sort of like, it was a natural response to kind of like to comply with the needs of the crisis. You need to first take care of your sort of like addiction needs.
I think that's very reasonable that people are going to behave if they are substance users in that way. I think the important thing is not to marginalize people who, are addicts and are trying to avoid withdrawal. If they disrupt social distancing because of that, it's important to, consider that within the medical situation that they're in, and that we should be thinking in more creative ways to assist addicts at this time, rather than penalize them for trying to avoid dope sickness, like the sickness that comes from withdrawal and the dangers that come from withdrawal. And that's a more medical perspective, and one that I hope gains more mainstream traction, that, addiction has a, biochemical basis. It does change how the brain responds to things. And with that, being said, we have to be really mindful about that right now.
Thank you so much. Defne, are you around? Would you like to speak a little bit? The statement that Defne and my other friend, Natasha Jimbala, are the curators of the upcoming edition of Gwangju Biennale. And since Gwangju is one of the countries hit with, like other Asian countries, hit with the pandemic, there's been like disruptions in the plans to have the Biennale. So it usually, Gwangju Biennale happens in early September or mid-August or something. And then a couple of days ago, Defne and Natasha wrote this really, really moving statement and signed it and posted it in social media, which was both a little bit of an update of what's going on with the Biennale, not much, but also a lot of like great ideas and sort of like ways of looking at what Korea, but all the world is going through. So Defne, you care to join us? Maybe you want to just like reiterate what caused you guys to really write this curatorial statement about the crisis rather than the Biennale or the artist or something. And it was quite a successful statement too. I really I read it a few times and it was—
Mind you say that, we're looking how Korea is dealing with it, because it's the ultimate deployment of surveillance tools and very agile legal tools that they have enabled in the face of public health crisis because of their experience with previous pandemics, right? That's why they could do it so fast. And in Gwangju, there is actually not much infection, surprisingly, but it's more in Seoul and Daegu and so forth. So a lot of the cultural institutions shut down till mid-April, and we got affected, for shipment purposes, for travel reasons, artists who have to produce on-site work and want to produce work in Jeju, like engaging with the histories of massacres there and so forth. They cannot go. If they go now, they would be quarantined 14 days before they can go in. So everybody's sort of border shutdowns, currency fluctuations, money issues, bureaucracy. I mean, it's quite a ride. And we just made also a statement to the foundation. What we care most is that the artists get paid first and foremost, because it's such a precarious situation right now. Like everybody.
I'm so glad Reza's not here right now, but go ahead. You can question, because Reza was like totally questioning this, like, why should artists get money? Why should people who deserve it more? And then, of course, there was like a litany of opposition to what Reza had to say, me included. But yeah, but go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
We just insist on it to the foundation that at least that is rolled out. So we're finalizing the artist agreements. So we thought, okay, this is a moment we have to say, you know, we're aware of all the movements that have been shut down by the COVID-19, you know, everybody protest movements from Hong Kong to Istanbul to Egypt to whatnot, Iran, like everything gone quiet. It's all about COVID, and all the feminist discourse in Korea has been shut down. I mean, like basically it's been, so we had to also say that we honor and we're aware that the spirit is alive, even though everything looks like the focus is on COVID, and we just take it day by day. We had to say that because there is no, you know, everybody say, oh, are we going to come? Can we come? Cancel, postpone? We just take it day by day, and we just had to make that transparent, because what's the point of continuing?
So the Biennale is not canceled, but the opening date is not confirmed.
It is still the same. There is no change, because the discussion is if you move it to October, November, and so forth, then the virus might come back. That's what, you know, from Denmark to Korea, that's what everybody is saying. So it's completely, even though the situation is stabilizing in Korea, like we're completely, anything can spin in any direction. And our responsibility is to the artists we work with. And we also, I mean, you know how, because the Biennale is, I mean, for some of you, maybe you're not familiar, but the Biennale is really important to the city. It's a way for them to mourn what happened in 1980 with the student movement that has been crushed down by the paratroopers of their own country that were initially trained for North Korea. So the biennial has been actually established to honor. So it's not just a biennial or yet another exhibition. So it has actually immense value to the citizen groups and activists in the city. Of course, it's a certain generation of activists. It's not the new generation. There's hierarchies of suffering that we are looking at. Sorry, what did you want to say, Mo?
I was going to say that my experience of participating as an artist in the 2016 edition curated by María was that, because I got an extra, extra Canada Council grant to stay in Gwangju for a month after the opening, right? It was lovely. But I basically managed to go to the site and see, and it was unbelievable the amount of people, regular humans, that were visiting it during the weekdays. And in the weekend, it was really engaged with public. And it really reflected what you're saying in terms of this Biennale means a lot to the people of the city, and they take it really seriously. And as you know, the opening of it is on national TV. Yeah, so the opening ceremonies becomes like a
political machine. I mean, mayors and ministers showing up. I mean, where you feel you're the apparatchiks to some higher game, but it's just, yeah, that's why we took it on, right? Who wants to do another biennial in this D&H, for God's sake? I was like, sorry. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up. I was not prepared to speak,
it was a really great statement.
For allowing me to share it with everybody.
Thank you so much. So we're getting close to, like, we're already having our extra. I have MMT question from Colin, but maybe I can wait and attend the Saturday seminar, because it's really like an amazing thing he's doing. I'll get back to it, because I think MMT is really like an important discourse for today's politics, for especially leftist politics. And what Colin's doing is he's basically opening up the discussion of what is MMT and its uses on a bed made of 2 layers. The mattress is the history of Bank of England in 1600, but also seen in 4 plays by Shakespeare. So like there's 3 layers to it: contemporary, the Shakespearean layer, and then the actual history of Bank of England from that period when England started to use fiat money. Right. Did I characterize the seminars properly?
Yeah, if I can just sort of briefly, I mean, one of my fundamental claims is that the modern monetary system has not really superseded the what I call the ancien regime monetary system, but it rather has So the past of money has modern monetary system, and I argue that there's always a price that has to be paid and continued in order for this repression. What we call monetary crisis is really sort of the failure of this repression to this repression of the past of money. And so I'm going to be trying to talk a little about the politics of money, which kind of give us a clue about that exact and that structures the system. So Shakespeare, that's why we're looking at Shakespeare. And I guess
lovely.
In addition, monetary sovereignty, definition of sovereignty, and
they have a little bit different
philosophy.
You want to turn your video off so we get your sound, because your sound is like compromised a little bit. So if you turn your video off, the signal. Yeah, go ahead now. Go ahead.
Can you?
Continues on, but
No,
maybe
not
it's better.
Not
Go
so
ahead.
much. Well, okay. So I'll try to talk a little slower. Maybe that will help. So the second part is that MMT is based upon the idea of monetary sovereignty is a key term for them. But what I'm going to be kind of arguing is that they have a tautological definition of sovereignty. It's not very rich. I'm going to try to put some bones on that. So I'll leave it at that.
Lovely. Yeah. So basically, you're basically saying sovereignty is based on the ability to issue like value or like money, right? Instead of any kind of like self-referential idea of sovereignty.
Well, so I mean, so really, the beginning place is Jean Bodin, the theorist, the political theorist of the 16th century, argues that the sovereign cannot bind himself with his own promises. So essentially, that the sovereign cannot promise his own sovereignty. This is kind of fundamental to the idea of sovereignty in the past, but really, the modern monetary order, the kind of liberal constitution, is based around the rejection of Bodin to say that yes, the sovereign can and must bind itself with its own promises. And that is what kind of creates the kind of fiscal constraints that we hear so much about in our politics.
Thank you so much. Any questions?
There was one question asked in the chat to me by Raphael.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'm glad you saw it. Go ahead.
No, he was asking about the solidarity between neighbors, because in the very beginning we were talking a bit about the question of solidarity and the fact that neighbors start to interact and this kind of thing, and whether there was a potential narrative that could come out of that. And for me, this kind of linked to a bigger issue. I spoke a lot about temporalities because that's so important for narratives, but of course, the first thing one might think of is more the spatialities and how, you know, our world has constantly been expanding, at least for, I think, us who are here, like traveling more, seeing more world and so on. And now for the first time since I was born, my world started to shrink again. So frontiers got shut down, the frontiers of Europe, of the country. And now in France, they only can go 1 kilometer from their homes and so on and so forth. So now suddenly we're again like in this smaller world and looking around. And I was indeed speaking to my neighbors, and I wouldn't have spoken to them if Corona hadn't happened, because they were due to travel to Uzbekistan, right? And now they're at their window looking out on the street because there is no trip to Uzbekistan. So kind of, we now look for activity, for thing around us again. And I think it can hope. I mean, the positive thing would be to think that it can create some more attention for the immediate surroundings, and that we not just be happy to rebook our flight to Uzbekistan when this is over, but we actually feel a bit more anchored in our immediate surroundings, if this is something which is desirable. And I think it is, because the climate crisis goes on happening during Corona and will go on happening after Corona. So if this would be something that could come out of that would be, of course, a very good outcome, I think.
Man, I totally forgot we were gonna go to Central Asia. I totally forgot that. I guess that whole thing is now on hold, right?
Yeah, for me, you mean the project?
Yeah, totally, yeah.
Yeah. Uzbekistan, Georgia, they're both on hold. Yeah. Even the person managing the project was diagnosed with COVID and.
Oh my God.
To the hospital, yeah. So.
Okay, well, let me know when it gets activated again.
Mo, could I ask Klaus a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Klaus, I'm wondering.
You want to turn your camera on?
It's broken. I need to start using a different device. But so sorry. But Klaus, I was wondering if you could just talk like very briefly, because earlier you were talking about temporality and narrative, and sort of like the way that maybe narratives in general, or maybe more specifically different types of narratives, like craft us like specific dispositions towards time in terms of either prediction or sort of I would say like reminiscence or something. But I'm wondering in this instance, and this is based off something I was reading from a friend about sort of the ghost. And I'm thinking also what I was reading was about sort of like the Hamlet's father and sort of like the return of these repressed memories and these return of these repressed histories in the form of like ghosts. And I'm wondering if there's any way that you might think about like even the return of these pandemics that we've never heard of. Like, is there any like sort of feature or facet of narrative that you're tuned with that can sort of like pay attention to these returns, like these returns of the repressed or something like this?
Good question. I mean, one thing that I didn't mention, because I kind of talked about the prediction, and I think it doesn't answer your question, but it has to do with return, is the fact that there's some kind of potential for regression as well, of course. I mean, there's also a regression narrative right now happening. So it's not only about like what's going to happen, there's also the potential of, what was the one place in opening up again. And then as soon as they opened up, they had new cases coming up again. So they felt like we were over it. They were in the future and suddenly they were in the past again. So there's, and strangely, people really tend to think of this in terms of past and future rather than different states, because of course, it's not really the past. It's other people getting infected, but it feels like, oh, there were 20 people infected in the beginning of this, then there were 2,000, then there were none, and now there are 20 infected again. So the statistics makes it seem like it's the same. Of course, it's 20 other people, but we kind of have this feeling of return. There's a certain return of the repressed, and the repressed in this case is the virus. But I don't. But in terms of the ghost, I don't know. I don't have a key to.
So Klaus, just before we wrap up, so how do you account for like your example right now, right? So basically, a linear narrative, which is what most people think of when they think of like narrative, right? Like a story that has like beginning, middle, and past, present, future, right? And this type of like these new forms of narrative we've seen for a long time in literature, and then at least since late 90s in cinema, where like multiple narratives are being overlaid, but there's still something narratological about it, but it's not like, how can we sort of like read the crisis with these new forms of like network narratives or whatever you want, lysomatic narratives, or then kind of like linear narratives, right? Because we kind of need to understand that like, yeah, it is not return to the past, but this thing will have its own life again. It's a new life, come back again, right? Or something like that, right? So this, because even like as we discussed earlier, even data has some level of narrative built into it, right? Like from the way it's organized and from the way it's obtained from the world, right?
Totally. And I mean, in the sense where I defined it in the beginning, it's definitely a chain of events over time, right? At least the data that people are using here, like how many people get sick, how many people get cured, these are all events, and these are then, yeah. I think, and that's maybe also, maybe was a limit of my first presentation, that there are actually multiple narratives right now. I mean, the narrative in Austria is different from the narrative in Serbia, is different, very different from the narrative in China. And there are actually many of these narratives that run in parallel. And then the question always becomes, okay, which is the one that like is going to be the template for the story that we will tell about our future in this pandemic, right? Do we think we are like, should we be like Shanghai, or should we be like this other city? Should we do contact tracing that worked for them? So like people are trying to figure out which are the narratives that are both compatible with the means that they have at their disposal. How many tests do you have? If you don't have as many tests as another country, you can't like do the global testing thing of your population. What are the democratic norms? What will people accept? What are acceptable narratives as well for my country? It's not just what are efficient narratives. The Chinese narrative is super efficient in terms of only this one value, which is bringing the virus down. But it wouldn't work everywhere because it implies that you become a totally a regime basically that becomes totally non-democratic. Yeah.
Klaus, I'm asking too many questions from you, but you said situations in Austria. I heard that now you have to wear a mask in Austria or like in Vienna, right? Something like that. Is that true?
Starting from today, they're distributing masks for free. So this is also a question of means, right? I think in some country, when you're 60 million, you can't so easily get enough masks to distribute it to everyone who goes to supermarket and then make it mandatory. So it's mandatory in the supermarket.
But if you're in a country where every single person is a fucking rich Austrian, sorry, you can't distribute masks to them, right? Because exactly. There's so few.
So there is, of course, there's this idea that somehow this virus is democratic, and you see that even Boris Johnson can get it, basically. But of course, the treatment is not democratic. I mean, that's what Sophie is also seeing. So there is kind of like this idea, yes, the danger has universalized. And funnily, this is an idea that Ulrich Beck, sociologist from Munich, already formulated in 1986, but talking about the nuclear menace, saying, okay, the nuclear menace has actually erased the frontiers, and the viral menace somehow is also democratic. But of course, yeah, the treatment is not democratic at all.
So the mask is mandatory because they're handing it down?
It will become mandatory next Monday. And I'm not sure how far it will be mandatory, only in places where you're with other people. So,
but you know how interesting that is, because up until they do that, the other law in Austria, which I was told many times when I visited in the winter, is that if you put a scarf, you couldn't cover your chin and your mouth, because then you might be an ISIS terrorist, right? So we're going from like a ban on scarf over your face to a mandatory mask, you know, like over a course of like this illness.
Yeah, totally. And what's interesting is that it's both the same logics. It's like a political logics versus a kind of health logics. Suddenly health primes all political, many political concerns in terms of protection of citizen right. In this case, prevention of a citizen right, which is the right to cover your face, which is basically taken away from people. But yeah, so there are these influences between these two levels that are, of course, really.
I really hope that ISIS people don't start wearing masks and causing menace in Austria, because this is like a great opportunity, right?
I heard that ISIS forbade anybody from going to Europe. They quarantined Europe. I don't know if that's true or not, but
you know, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. You know, we really should go, but like I really wanted to say this. In Turkmenistan, I read credible sources that like the use of the word corona has been banned, and if you use it, you go to jail, and if you wear a mask, you go to jail, because you are endangering public mental health, because by wearing it, you're kind of falling into the Western propaganda of there is a pandemic, so people cannot even wear masks in public. So it's like government is actively using politics in a way that would like cause the illness to spread, even though Turkmenistan is like near China and all that. I just cannot believe this. Look what you guys did, Valentin. You like imperialist Soviets. What kind of like wreckage you left behind? I'm kidding.
Turkmenistan has a lot of weird policies, but I would expect it to be pretty much secluded. I don't really think it's. I mean, you know, in Turkmenistan there is a law you cannot celebrate your birthday in a public place.
What?
Yes, it's a Muslim country with a weird twist. You know, it's not a country where you go to a concert and you infect 200 people by hugging. I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, maybe Turkmenistan made this choice between, you know, eco-fascism when, you know, you let some people die and economy of Turkmenistan. I don't know, but like, I mean,
non-existent. As someone who lived in Kyrgyzstan previously, I can say that Turkmenistan's kind of like the odd sibling of those Central Asian countries, kind of the odd one out. They don't have internet, and you can't wear your shoes in the capital city, among other strange.
Still, they have one of the biggest contemporary art museums in like Central Asia. I think in the like post-Soviet space, because, you know, some people are very rich.
Yeah, I know that when I was working for the Open Society Foundation, we had tried to go to Turkmenistan because there's a serious heroin epidemic there, and they don't let in any foreign observers to consult the healthcare system there, and it's quite in shambles. So,
you know,
we'll see how this shakes out.
The capital of Turkmenistan is like literally 3 hours drive from the third largest city in Iran, which has been hit hard with Corona. But I guess these borders are really tight, right? I don't know. I don't trust those borders, you know? So I don't know. It's like Ashgabat is really on the border with Iran almost, right? The capital city. So I don't know. It worries me when I hear like policies like that. It's like, what is going on? Anyways, if there isn't any question, maybe we can kind of like wrap up tonight. It was really nice that everyone showed up. We couldn't broadcast live to YouTube because of Zoom problems, but we had almost 70 people in our Zoom in like a second and the third. So like interface window. And we will make this video available ASAP. We upload it right away and make it public on YouTube for everyone to watch. And for all of you who are like here from the New Center community, please help us organize more of these in the following Wednesday. We got one organized next Wednesday. We're gonna bring back a Brunella and Davor, which will talk about sort of like the cybernetic impact of this crisis. We also have other guests. If Kasra, you want to turn your camera on and give us like a report on next week.
And cat people are getting ever cuter, much more.
I can't hear you, Kasra. Is it just me?
My microphone cannot be on.
Yeah, I can't hear him either.
You hear him from my mic, because if you turn the both mics on, there's going to be.
Yourself.
Yeah, so no, I'm on mute. So what are you going to say? Yeah.
No, nothing.
Yeah, so thank you, everyone. Please get involved. If you're not a member, we have a really inexpensive way to become member now. And if you can't afford it, we'll give you a free membership. Just contact us and we can provide you with that. And email one of us, email just organizers at the New Center, and then we'll set you up. If you come into these meetings, you deserve to be a member of the New Center. So it just got constituted at this moment. Yes. And please follow. I've been really looking forward to Colin's seminar, which starts Saturday, because I'm very curious about modern monetary theory. Also, like the Klaus seminar on visual narrative, it started last week, but there's 3 more sessions, and then we got 2 more sessions with Anna going and some other people. Yeah, so thank you all for being here, and see you soon. And Defne, I can't wait to have coffee with you at our favorite coffee shop, halfway between my home and yours. So but you know the coffee shop's open, right? So that's good, for takeout only. Yeah. I hope to run into you in the neighborhood. See you all.
Ciao.
Ciao.
See you, bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for this. Thanks, bye.
Bye, bye.
Bye, bye-bye.
Thank you.